what his eyes were telling her. "It is," she agreed, a hint of excitement in her voice. "It's crazy," she said, bumping him slightly with her shoulder. And Moss smiled nervously. "So they haven't told you anything?" he asked, trying not to sound as though he was pumping her for information. "Nah. As I said, it's all hush-hush," she whispered, while her partner walked slowly around the room, scanning the space. With almost everything in the room having slid back into the walls, there was little for him to examine, though he made a show of it anyway. "Gotcha," Moss answered as easily as he could muster, and pressed a finger against his lips in a playful shush. "But word this morning is that it was a big one," she said, and her partner almost imperceptibly cocked his head, obviously listening as he ran his fingertips over Moss's foutier. "Oh," Moss muttered, intensely watching her partner make his way around the room. "When I was assigned this sector, I made sure we came here first so you could get back to work," she said. But Moss was hardly listening as her partner neared Moss's workspace. "Moss? Yeah," he answered, and turned to look at her. He watched her pupil dilate mechanically. Could she tell how nervous he was? That he was hiding something? His heart raced. He could feel sweat rolling down his sides under his loose shirt, and he wanted to ask why his friend suspected him but was acting so cavalier. "I said I wanted to make sure you could go back to work," she said, with a wink, and for a moment he forgot about everything else. He laughed, and it sounded awkward even to himself as he said, "Thanks. No problem. Some people are going to have to wait quite a while, and there's pretty much nothing you can do," she explained. "I noticed," Moss said as the man pulled open his drawer to expose the pile of chips. His palms were damp, his breath short, and he nearly blurted out the truth. He did not. He simply swallowed hard as the guard looked up at him. "What's all this?" he asked as he ran a gloved hand through the chips, causing them to roll and click around the drawer. "Porn?" Moss blurted without thinking. "I'll bet it is," Izzy cried out, laughing, and gave him a light punch on the shoulder. "At least he's honest," the guard said to Izzy, picking up a chip thoughtfully before dropping it back into the drawer. "Oh, he's nothing if not honest, Clam," she said, still chuckling. She whispered excitedly, "Oh, Gibbs is gonna toast you for this one." "Ugh, I know," Moss replied with a hangdog look and sighed a deep relief as Clam closed the drawer. He couldn't believe the moment. He was hiding an intense terror for something he didn't understand, and these two had no idea. He felt the weight of guilt on his chest. He was lying to the world, hiding something from the employer who raised him from a boy, from his best friend whose family had cared for him when his parents went away. He was exhilarated, too. He had pulled one over on everyone. In a few short moments, he had picked a side and gotten away with deception. "My dad says hi, by the way," Izzy added as Clam continued around the room. Moss felt as though, now that they had checked and not found anything in the one place something was hidden, they should be on their way. But he continued to sweep the room. "Give him my love," Moss said, and he meant it. Vihan had always been so kind to him, treating him almost as another child. "I will," Izzy said happily, shooting Moss the smile which had made him weak in the knees for years. "I won't mention the porno," she added with a wink, and he felt that same guilt about the relief aid which he felt so often of late. "All right," Clam said. "The kid's clean." "Of course he is," Izzy said easily. "If you're quite done flirting, you can check him off the list," he said, so matter-of-factly that it dumbfounded both of them. "I wasn't flirting," Izzy protested, turning a shade of pink he had not seen in what felt like an age. And for the first time, Moss felt a glimmer of hope that she felt the same about him. "And analysis," Moss heard, and it almost sounded hurried. Izzy looked down to the screen on the forearm of her armor and made a note. "Hex cleared. Thank you for your cooperation. Employee, you have been awarded 5 productivity points," the voice announced through the speaker. "All right, let's get out of here." Clam gestured for the door before looking at Izzy and pointing to the drawer. "With all that, who knows what he wants to do to you?" Izzy was not caught off guard this time and said wryly, "Oh, I know what he wants to do to me." Moss nearly collapsed to the floor. What had that meant? She had never joked like that with him, always treating him like a brother. "You two are wired," Clam said, looking down on both of them as though they were children. "Dinner with the rent tonight?" Izzy asked. And Moss remembered that he was supposed to leave the burb for reasons he didn't understand. "Maybe later in the week," he forced from his now intensely dry mouth, his tongue moving like cardboard. "I'll hold you to that." She smirked, and the two turned to leave. Alone in his hex, an oppressive, near-silent electric buzz closed in around Moss. Everything in the room emitted a sound which he had never before noticed, but which now seemed to press on his brain. He sat in the middle of the room, pushing his hands on the plastic floor for support. He was exhausted. Not physically tired, but psychologically drained. In back-to-back moments, his world had turned upside down. He crawled over to his workspace and called Gibbs again, but got the same automated reply. He needed to talk to someone. Let one train of thought leave his lips, rather than having them all bang around in his head. Shower. The small door at the side of his hex slid open, and the water began to run at the preset temperature. He stripped, not bothering with the automated dressing arms, and left his clothes crumpled on the floor. He stepped in, letting the water pour over his thin, muscular frame. Black hair matted over his closed eyes. What was he going to do? He had lied to Izzy, but it wasn't too late. He could call her back, tell her everything, and help her earn that promotion Vihan insisted she deserved. He could win her favor that way. Maybe she would see him differently then. Maybe she already did. Perhaps he would even get a promotion for his duty to the company. Or be jailed for his part. He could be dragged away, have his bounty sold to Carcer Corp, and stay locked away for the rest of his days. Once more he needed to speak to someone. Shower off, dry? The water reduced quickly. The vent covers opened, and warm air began swirling around the tight space. He stepped from the shower determined, put his work linens in the laundry chute manually, dressed in a clean outfit, and headed toward the door, followed by the buzz in his head. He stepped from the cold floor of his hex onto the soft carpet of the hallway, his light slip-on shoes sinking slightly into the ground. Pairs of security officers were entering and exiting hexes, and he heard shouting as he moved down the hall. He passed an open door and watched as 2 guards wrestled a heavy-set naked man to the ground. "Desist, employee!" one of the guards shouted through a closed helmet. Moss started as the 2 forced his hands, and the man screamed indistinct obscenities. He jiggled as he writhed against them. Moss could not move, transfixed by the scene before him. He had never witnessed violence in his life. He had played at it in video games and watched it in movies. But this was completely foreign to him. It was ugly and brutal, and he hated to watch it but could not look away. One of the guards looked up and barked, "Close!" in his mind before the door slid shut. With every passing moment, Moss became more convinced that the day was a lucid dream, and he would soon awaken with no memory of any of this. He reached out a finger and ran it along the white wall, bright under the fluorescent lights. It was there. He tried to put it all from his mind and forced his legs to carry him toward the elevator. It was a long way through the rows of hexes, dotted occasionally with restrooms, common rooms, and gyms. At the center of the burb lay the elevators, which looked out over an open space from which one could see all the floors of the structure. At the top was a massive skylight to let in the gray natural light. And at the bottom, a shopping area and menagerie. The shopping space was for those employees who preferred browsing racks of items, rather than picking something off a screen and having the item delivered to their hex. The menagerie housed a clone of some long-extinct animal which served as the mascot for the burb. 2152 had tigers, which yawned and lazed on heated rocks amidst plastic trees. Moss loved to sit and look at the animals, wondering absently about a time when the massive beasts roamed the earth. He marveled at their impressive jaws and paws, and couldn't believe that so weak a species as man could drive them to extinction. He looked down at the tiny orange specks and called for the elevator, which dropped quickly to his floor as the halls were largely void of people. Moss stepped in and rode to the top floor. His stomach turned. His body was so unaccustomed to the rapid movement that he was always left queasy during the ride. The hexes at the top here were larger than those below, with glass-paneled walls looking into the office-fronted apartments. People sat at desks with hollow-projected monitors before them as Moss passed, hearing their commands. Data analysis, collate information, check drudge. All rather innocuous, but no less dumbfounding to Moss. He was racked with guilt, ill at ease with the invasive nature of this newly unlocked skill. He made his way to the office of Mr. Green and knocked on the glass door. He watched as his mentor looked up and smiled, a hint of confusion on his normally stalwart face. Mr. Green had hired Moss right out of school, though he had not placed high on his aptitude exams, and taken Moss under his wing, helping to guide him into his career as an engineer. Though he was still unsure what he was going to say, he knew he needed to say something to someone. "Allow entry," Moss heard Mr. Green command his personal drudge, who complied wordlessly, or thoughtlessly. Moss was unsure how even to categorize the machine. While the drudges in the field were hulking robots designed to withstand the elements, the office variety were much more human in their design. Their form was that of a person, though skinless and mechanical, all polished plastic and metal. Their heads had a screen where the face would be. Most managers used it to display information, but others had a computer-generated human face display. Mr. Green was one of the latter, preferring, as he said, the human touch. The machine approached the door, which moved slightly back before sliding along the wall. "Good morning, Moss," the face of a handsome young man said in a near-perfect rendering of a human voice. Moss couldn't believe it was still morning. He felt as though a year had passed since he first heard the knocking on his door. "Good morning, Eric," Moss replied in affected nonchalance. "Hey, bud," Mr. Green welcomed in his nasal, monotone voice, standing and waving Moss in. "You came without an appointment. This must be important." Moss moved over and sank into the comfortable chair opposite the older man. Mr. Green was a third-generation employee. His grandparents helped establish Burb 2152. He had a picture of them mounted on the wall behind his desk, the young couple standing and smiling in front of the Burb with a grand opening banner hanging over the door. They looked so happy, Moss mused, surprised he had said the words aloud. Mr. Green turned in his chair to look at the picture as well. They were, he agreed. Will and Linda Green were pioneers of a new work style. They gave us what we have today. They may not have been trailblazers like the colonists, but they created a new world in a different way. At the time, you must understand, not everyone was enthusiastic about living in employer-provided housing, to say nothing of sending their children to employer-provided schools. Many needed convincing, and my grandparents were among the first to help pitch people on the idea. He beamed with pride, as though he himself was the one who had the accomplishments. Trendsetters, definitely, Moss agreed, calming down slightly for the first time all morning, comforted by the small talk. My brother still lives in Hex 1. It's been in our family since that day, he said, hooking a thumb at the picture. Neat, Moss said, looking at the photo of two happy people posing on opening day. The picture was rendered in black and white to give it an old-time appearance. What's up, Moss? Mr. Green asked, and Moss looked down at him. His beard was precisely manicured, his small brown eyes calculating behind rimless glasses. Something happened today, Moss started. Begin security recording, he heard in his mind, and realized that Mr. Green was now filming their conversation. It made him uncomfortable, and he shifted uneasily in the chair. He had always counted Mr. Green as an ally, but now he was recording him? Moss swallowed hard and felt his leg begin to bounce again. What happened? He led. Well, Moss stuttered, steeling himself to just tell him everything. I don't even know how to describe it. You can tell me, Mr. Green pressed, with a hint of impatience in his voice. It's just, Moss began before he heard, security on standby. Eric shifted into a slightly aggressive posture, its mechanical arms raising ever so slightly. Moss couldn't believe it. Excuse me? He blurted without thinking. Excuse you what? Mr. Green said suspiciously, his eyes narrowing to slits. Moss was enraged. His hands were fists, shaking. This man, who he had counted on, trusted when he felt he couldn't trust anyone, had called security on him. His rational mind screamed that any good manager would call security when a nervous employee came to them during a lockdown, but that voice was quashed by the fury of betrayal. The room felt tense, tight, like the oxygen was leaking out. Moss tried to keep a serene expression on his face. Excuse me for coming unannounced like this. It's just what? Mr. Green growled. All pretext of friendship was gone. Just, Ira stole another work order today and I think I need some vacation time, Moss said, deciding to keep his secret. Oh. Mr. Green played it relaxing, but his body was still taut. That's what you came here for? Moss, are you sure about that? Moss let his head drop. Yeah. You don't need to come to your supervisor to register for vacation time, but I can certainly help you set it up since you are here. And while his tone had turned kind, Moss felt something, just under the surface, lurking like a shark in the deep blue, ready to strike. When were you hoping to take your days? Tonight. Well, tomorrow, that is. That's why I came to see you, since the system requires a week's advance notice. Moss was impressed with himself that for a second time in the day he had covered his tracks so quickly. I see, Mr. Green said, sounding less dubious and more himself. Ira really got to you? He did. I think I just need a break, Moss answered as Mr. Green opened his file, lifting his glasses to squint at the screen. You've never taken a vacation before, he observed. Why now? Just the Ira thing? Yeah, Moss said. Not all the security action? He fished, staring into Moss's eyes, gauging his reaction. Moss was disappointed that the man who he had trusted for so long seemed so suspicious of him. But he understood why. Mr. Green had been a company man his whole life and valued Thudico above all else. He had tried to instill the same feelings in Moss, but they never quite took. "Nah, I cleared that easily," Moss said, thinking about the flailing man he had passed. "That's good to hear. Albeit unsurprising," he said, and a gentle smile crossed his lips. "I can authorize vacation beginning the day after tomorrow." "Oh, I'd really like to begin tomorrow," he pushed, unsure where the night would take him. Mr. Green raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure there isn't something you're not telling me?" he asked, in a way which bordered on insisting, and Moss questioned if he should just say it, be done with it rather than go along with this plan. But he was in it now, and a determination to see through whatever this was overtook him. He would see Ina again. He would bring her the chip, and he would find out about his parents. "Nope, just ready to lie on the beach for a few days," he lied, and let a broad grin cross his lips. "Going to hit up Sea Dome?" Mr. Green asked, looking at his screen and approving the vacation. "I keep hearing how amazing it is. Maybe I'll take surfing lessons during the day and watch the fire dancers at night. I've never been in water, other than my shower," he admitted. "It is a good time," Mr. Green agreed. "I take the husband there twice a year." "You've mentioned. It's what inspired me to try it," Moss said, and was surprised how easily the lies were coming to him. He had never once contemplated going to the Sea Dome, even when Gibbs rather forcefully invited him. "Good to hear I can impart some wisdom outside of work," he said, and Moss saw the word approved on the screen before he switched it to another. "Looks like you're closing in on level 2. Moss knew he was only at 78.64%. Every day a little closer. He felt like he was still a long way off. "You sure you wouldn't rather wait for your vacation until you hit 2? You unlock some good perks at the beach houses. You'll be stuck in a pretty small cabana at your current level." He looked up from under black eyebrows, head still tilted at the screen. Moss couldn't get a read on the situation. Mr. Green had visibly dropped his guard, but continued to press him in a way he was unaccustomed to. "I'm not that close," Moss said in a joking tone, though he felt it was all too true. "A couple of good months and you'll be there. I believe in you," he said, and Moss trusted him. "I've watched you come a long way since you were a boy. I see something in you. You have a spark, a drive, which is rare, but sometimes I wish you acted on it more." Moss nodded, thinking about how he stole that second work order with pride. "You have this untapped well, and I just hope you find it." "I think I'm beginning to," Moss said. "Anyway, this vacation will help to recharge my battery, get out of my head a bit," Moss said quietly, no less determined, but slightly guilty for the decision he had made. Mr. Green was so supportive, and here Moss was deceiving him. He chuckled. "Well, no one ever said I wish I had spent more time at the office on their deathbed." Moss smiled and nodded. "Right," he agreed. "You are approved for a week of vacation beginning tomorrow. Was there anything else? I would like to hear more about this Ira thing, but I don't really have all day," he said graciously. "Nothing else, Mr. Green, but thank you," Moss said as he backed toward the door, Eric moving alongside him. "Make an appointment when you return, and let's catch up," he said. "I'd like that," Moss replied, wondering if he would have another conversation with Mr. Green. He left the office and returned to his hex. The floor was still abuzz with security. Moss quickly brought up the vacation menu at his workstation and booked himself a week's stay at the cheapest cabana he could find in Sea Dome, expecting he would never step foot within it. Not wanting to stay confined within his mind for the rest of the day, he logged back into work. "Welcome back," Tu said. "Was it the pipes?" "Yes," Moss told his drudge. "It was the pipes." Chapter 4. "We have to complete one more work order before the end of the shift," Tu informed Moss. "I think I would rather check you into a repair station for diagnostics before the night shift," Moss said. "I'll be off for a while, and who knows how the others will treat you." "This is an acceptable course of action," Tu complied. "I see you rented a vacation house. You just wish to get away from work? You have never done so before." "Yeah, it's time for me to see the world," Moss said with a smirk. Tu pointed his camera at the vast landscape of solar panels and profit route. "The Sea Dome seems a better option than this." Moss chuckled. "No kidding. After the morning with Osiris, a burst pipe, and security checks, I can understand wanting a break," Tu put in. "Thanks. It's nice to know someone understands," he said, knowing that Thudico could access his conversations with Tu at any point. He slowed the bike as they approached the massive hangar which served as the repair center. Drudges of every type moved about, fixing bikes and heavy machinery, moving debris and inputting data. As he always did, Moss wondered about every person behind every drudge. He wondered if they were even in this burb, what they loved to eat and do, and how they passed their time outside of work. These absent thoughts kept him occupied as he parked the bike and slid 2 off before walking him to check in for repair. He brought up the menu and queued 2 up for analysis before preparing to log out. "Have a nice week, Moss," 2 said as the logout initiated. "Goodbye, 2, Moss said. Logging out, he realized that work had been a welcome distraction, but now he was alone with his thoughts once more. He opened the drawer and pulled out the chip. He could differentiate it, as it had 0027 inscribed on the face. So much had happened today for this chip. He wondered if the security officers were even told if this is what they were looking for, and decided that they were likely kept in the dark on that detail. Perhaps only the security chiefs were given all the information, as Izzy and Clam seemed to be doing a general sweep. Or perhaps his friendship had saved him? He brought up a purchase menu to order some clothes suitable for the outside world, when the screen was overtaken. Incoming call. It was Gibbs, no doubt returning his calls now that the workday and security checks were done. He answered the call, Gibbs' wide face filling the screen before him. "Hey, man." "Hey, I got an alert saying you called. What's up? I'm gonna hit up the restaurant in a bit if you want to meet me," he offered. And it struck Moss how casual he was. His own world had changed so much in the day, it seemed weird that Gibbs was so normal, though of course he had little reason to be otherwise. "You mind stopping by my Hex?" he asked. Gibbs groaned. "You're not gonna make me watch Skills all night, are you?" he mocked into the camera, rolling his eyes dramatically. "No," Moss said, more seriously than he intended. His friend picked up on the tone. For as much as Gibbs could be foolish, more interested in chatting up girls than listening to his friends, he would always step up in a pinch. Moss knew he would walk through a minefield for him if he needed it. "All right, I'll be back soon, but I'm bringing beer," he stated. The idea of a drink was more appealing than it had ever been. "Perfect," Moss said. "Oh," Gibbs said in astonishment. "Great." Moss clicked him off and ordered black sneakers, denim pants, and a jacket with the Thudico logo on the back and Burb 2152 on the breast. He wanted something more nondescript, but there were no other options. The company always wanted its employees to be recognizable. After a minute, a voice came through the speaker. "Incoming order," the voice said, and the dumbwaiter next to the foodier clicked and thudded before opening to reveal the perfectly folded clothes wrapped in plastic. "Dress me," he commanded, and the arms unfolded from the ceiling as he stood. It was odd to him to use the neural commands, now that he knew people could eavesdrop on them. Though he had always known there was a digital record of all such orders, it felt different to him now. The arms unwrapped and unfurled the clothes as others stripped him, and within a moment he was dressed. Screen cam? He looked at himself on his screen. He was a different person. He pulled on the cuffs of the jacket, admiring himself. "Doorbell," the voice said through the speaker as Gibbs' image appeared in a box on the screen. "Allow entrance?" The door opened. "What the heck?" Gibbs gasped as he strode in, a case of Thudico's in-house bio-beer nestled under his arm. "Yeah," Moss said, holding his arms out. Gibbs looked him over and said in a mocking voice, "Going somewhere?" "Actually," he trailed off, not sure what to say. "Living room?" The desk and chair which served as Moss's workspace folded down and slid into panels within the wall, while another panel slid up and a couch with plastic-wrapped cushions moved out. A large screen swung down from the ceiling and began playing as Moss said, "Sit down." Gibbs shot him an incredulous look as the voice of Marisol May filled the room. "Good evening, employee. In just 37 short minutes, Burbs Has Skills will premiere." Mute. The room fell silent, leaving just the buzz. Moss turned a grim face to Gibbs, who opened the case and tossed him a beer. Gibbs sat on the couch, which squeaked and deflated under his weight. He looked at Moss with a peculiar mixture of confusion and glee. "What's going on?" A curious smile washed over his face. Moss did not know how to answer that question. He felt as though everything was going on. "I'm the security alert," he said, opening the beer and taking a sip and thinking himself rather cool. Gibbs burst into laughter before checking Moss's face and stopping. "What?" he asked, in what Moss thought was the most genuine bewilderment he had ever heard. He smiled and took another sip. "I don't even know where to begin," he said finally. He ran his finger over the lip of the beer can, trying to put all that had happened into words. His whole life had been so simple, and the straight trajectory of his existence now felt askew. "What do you mean? Why are you dressed like that? What are you talking about?" he squawked, sounding like Moss's brain. It felt good. Nice to be the one with some information. "You can't tell anyone," he warned, his voice low and ominous. Gibbs nodded, putting his drink on the floor and leaning in. "You know you can trust me." Moss knew nothing of the sort. In fact, he knew the very opposite. But at the moment, he didn't care. "While I was working this morning, a girl, woman, I don't know. This person knocked on my door." Gibbs interrupted. "Was she hot?" Moss let out an audible sigh. "Unimportant," he said, knowing describing the girl would derail the conversation for hours. "So she was." Gibbs smirked and rubbed his hands together. "Yes," Moss acquiesced so he could continue his story. "I let her in, and she gave me this." He held forth the chip. "All right," Gibbs said quizzically, taking the chip and flipping it over. Realizing there was nothing special about it, he handed it back and picked up his drink. "She said she knew my parents," Moss said, and though he was excited at the prospect of learning more about them, sorrow coated his words. "Really?" Gibbs asked, his eyes going wide. Moss almost never mentioned his parents, and his friend seemed genuinely interested in this revelation. "Yeah, and she asked me to meet her tonight," he explained. Gibbs looked him over. "And you're going?" he asked incredulously. "You?" "Yeah," Moss stated, holding his head high with a confidence he did not truly feel. "Into the city." Gibbs finished a beer and opened another, the crack and hiss of the can underlining his question. "Yeah." Moss did the same. "You'll be eaten alive," he said. Moss replied half-heartedly, "I'll be okay." "Moss," Gibbs said seriously, "I've been to the city. It's scary during the day, but outright terrifying at night. I hardly wanted to walk around, and I was being led by an armed tour guide. The people outside of the burbs lead hard, cold, miserable lives, and will be more than happy to cut your throat for that jacket. You have no idea what you were getting yourself into, no concept of the outside world, no reason for doing this, except that some pretty girl mentioned your dad," Gibbs concluded. It stung, for Moss knew the truth of the words. "I'm sick of this life, man. I do nothing, will do nothing. I don't know what this chip is. I don't know anything, sure, but it's something different," Moss argued. "Something different may get you killed," Gibbs noted sadly. "Death out there may be better than life in here," Moss said, trying to sound like a character from the superhero movies he so loved. "Who are you?" Gibbs said, looking down to his beer can while running his forefinger along the rim. "I don't know," Moss answered truthfully. "But I think it's time I find out." "So what's on the chip?" Gibbs asked. "No idea, but clearly it's something important. Ina suggested it could take down Thudako," Moss explained. "Who?" Moss sighed. "The girl." Gibbs nodded. "Okay, but why?" "She said the company was evil," Moss told him. Gibbs snorted. "We employ half the country and feed all of it, while providing necessary crops, textiles, and power from the toxic expanse. How is that evil?" Gibbs seemed personally hurt. "I'm gonna find out," Moss said, and Gibbs swallowed down another whole beer. "We're gonna find out," he corrected, extending a hand triumphantly. "Nope," Moss said with a cold finality that took Gibbs aback. Moss had anticipated this offer. He had known Gibbs long enough to know that if there was an opportunity to get into trouble, Gibbs would be right there. But Moss did not want to jeopardize another life. He knew that his would never be the same, but he could protect his friend. "What, you think you can protect me when this all comes out?" Gibbs said as though reading Moss's mind. "I'm safer out there with you than in here when they figure it out." Moss puffed himself up, trying to sound more confident than he actually was. "They won't figure it out." "Oh yeah? The second you don't show up for work tomorrow, you're gonna be red flagged," Gibbs retorted, in his element playing devil's advocate. "I took vacation time," Moss said with pride. "During a security check?" He guffawed. "Nothing suspicious about that." "I had a good pretext," Moss countered. "Even if you had the best excuse in the world, the company is going to be suspicious. Count on it. If you don't think that they are going to cross-check vacation time, or really every statistic, you are crazy. Already, I can tell you don't have the mind for this." Gibbs folded his arms across his chest. "You are going to need me." While Moss wanted to keep his friend out of all this, The idea of having a companion with him as he explored the city was appealing. Maybe, he said, staring at the muted television. Marisol's mouth moved soundlessly. Gibbs stared at his friend. Neither spoke for a long moment. What do you think she's like? Moss finally put words to the question he pondered every morning. Gibbs furrowed his brows. What? Marisol May. What do you think she is like in real life? Moss, he sighed, his words coated in pity. They are going to eat you alive out there. The truth dawned on him. His combined terror and excitement had carried him this far. But now he felt foolish and naive. Oh, he said. Moss dropped his head as Gibbs said the words he already knew. She isn't real. She's a CG construct. Right, Moss said, remembering all the times he imagined Marisol having breakfast, picking furnishings for her hex, and chatting with friends. Gibbs looked him in the eyes and stated plainly, You have to let me come with you. All right, Moss accepted. Good. Now tell me everything. Moss gave him a rundown of the entire day, leaving out only the part about Izzy possibly flirting. Gibbs listened quietly, drinking and offering beers where necessary. When he concluded, Gibbs rubbed his face with both hands. If this woman is to be believed, your parents were working against the company from the inside, he said. Moss nodded. Yeah. You've never really talked about them, he coaxed. Mr. Green told me they were killed by a malfunctioning drudge, but... He trailed off. But what? I have these memories. Like when you wake up halfway through a dream. Flashlights in the night, screams and promises. A hand being pulled away. I don't know. It's confusing, but when Ina said she knew them, I believed her. You think they scrubbed your memory? Gibbs asked, looking sorrowfully into Moss's eyes. I do now, he said. He tried to pull at those vague memories. Tried to bring them to the front of his mind, but he could not. That's messed up, Gibbs asserted. Moss simply nodded. You think they hacked your implant? Listened in since you're the child of rabble-rousers? I doubt it, Moss said softly. Why? Seems like the smart move. Maybe, but I was only 12, and if they scrubbed me, maybe they didn't think there was any reason to, he said, feeling empty. He had often questioned his parents' sudden departure from his life. Always felt that there was something more. The company line about a malfunctioning drudge had never quite added up to him. There had been an undeniable truth in Ina's words, and as more of the pieces came into place, his disgust with the company that had raised him was growing. He knew he needed more information, more answers. Plus, I guess security would have been on you if they knew you were visited, Gibbs said helpfully. True. Gibbs shifted nervously. And you can hear my thoughts? No. I can hear only the orders. However, the system differentiates thoughts from commands. I'm hacked into that. So, no help in the outside world, he observed. People don't use neural commands in the city? Moss asked. Gibbs just laughed. Let's go to my hex and get some stuff. You'll understand when we reach the city, he said, a devilish smile crossing his lips. Say goodbye to everything you think you know. Moss smirked and joked. Say goodbye to all your sick time. Chapter 5. Drunk, Moss and Gibbs meandered down the now dimly lit hallway. Moss tried to look calm, but his hand gripped the chip in his pocket, slick with sweat. As they passed a group of young women in cocktail dresses, Gibbs stared, lacking any subtlety. Man, you see the twins this morning? He asked, as though anyone had missed them. Yeah, Moss whispered as the girls looked back at them and rolled their eyes. I'm telling you, that night, Gibbs began, but Moss held up a hand to silence him. I know, he said impatiently. He didn't want to hear it again. His mind was split in so many ways he couldn't bear to listen to Gibbs talk about sex again. As they entered the hex, Moss looked around the space, where he left his wall screens blank, using them for little more than his ocean sunrise in the morning. Gibbs utilized his to the fullest, modeled after a late 20th century college dorm room. 2 windows looked out over ivy-coated brick buildings, and the spaces between were covered in posters. He switched them out regularly, always happy to lecture any visitors on the cultural significance of the image. 3 posters adorn the wall now, appropriately ripped and faded, the corners wrinkled as though adhered to the wall with sticky globs. Moss wondered how long his friend had spent altering the images to get them looking that way. An ecstatic Bob Marley grinned, surrounded by smoke from a large marijuana cigarette held in the middle of 2 fingers. Between the windows, the naked backsides of 6 women with Pink Floyd album covers painted on their backs sat lounging by a pool. Lastly, to the right was a black and red poster of a bearded man's face wearing a beret, the word Che written in block letters. "Pretty great, huh?" Gibbs asked as he pulled a beer from the pocket of his sagging pants. "As ever," Moss complimented. Gibbs beamed with pride. He, like many in the burbs, was obsessed with the period just before the Neo-Dark Age. Gibbs watched old movies and television shows and looked on those days with a reverence which Moss did not understand. He preferred the time in which he lived, the technology and ease of hex living. He did not romanticize some unobtainable past, and found engaging in that kind of hyperbole useless. The fact that he did the very same thing with superheroes and fantasy adventures was completely lost on him. "Dresser?" Gibbs thought, watching Moss's face. "Yeah, I heard that," Moss answered the unasked question as the wall opened and a rack of hanging clothes and drawers slid out. "So weird," Gibbs said, and Moss agreed as he heard, "Dress me for the city." Moss turned his back as the arms folded down. Gibbs snorted a laugh. "What?" Moss said over his shoulder. "I just tested to make sure you couldn't hear my thoughts." Gibbs chuckled as the arms from his ceiling pulled a shirt over his wide frame. "Oh, yeah?" "Yeah," he answered easily. "Called you a massive prude for turning around so quickly." "I'm just respecting your privacy," Moss defended. "Whatever you say, prude," he mocked, and for a brief moment this all felt normal to Moss. Hanging out with Gibbs, getting ready to go out, feeling reluctant and nervous while Gibbs excitedly made fun of him. It just felt like a weekend, where he had somehow been convinced by his friend to go to a nightclub. The comfort of normalcy. But the moment passed as he rubbed his thumb along the side of the chip. "What do you think it is?" Gibbs inquired. "What?" Moss asked. "The chip. What do you think it is? I mean, this company is so big there are bound to be some bad apples. But I can't imagine what will be on that which could be so damning as to take down a company like this," he said. "I have no clue. I'm honestly not sure Ina did either." "I guess we'll find out," he observed, and Moss heard him rummage through one of the drawers. Before he had time to turn around, he felt heavy plastic on his shoulder. He turned to see a Kingfisher stun blaster sitting next to his face. "Why do you have this?" Moss asked, aghast, turning to see Gibbs holding one as well. "Because the world is not a safe place." And while Moss knew the truth of his words, he had never experienced it. He reached for the weapon and held it in his palm, any sense of this being a normal moment evaporating entirely. It was unnatural in his hand as he put his finger on the trigger. The battery displayed 5 full green bars. "Wow," he uttered as he turned to watch Gibbs stash his in the waist of a pair of loose-fitting blue jeans. He wore a simple black t-shirt over another shirt with long yellow sleeves peeking from underneath and a brimmed cap on his head, red curls poking out. Moss tried to fit his weapon into a shallow pocket of his jacket, causing it to hang awkwardly to one side. Gibbs rolled his eyes and pulled the stunner from the pocket as he physically spun Moss back around and jammed the thing hard down the waist at his back. Moss let out a little shriek as the muzzle scraped his skin. He huffed. "You want to be seen with that the day of a security breach?" "I guess not," Moss said. "You guess not?" Gibbs exclaimed. "Moss, you gotta screw your head on. I know you think you have this all figured out, but this is some major stuff we are engaged in here. We could be arrested, or worse if we get caught. That chip in your pocket is tantamount to corporate treason. Following the trail of your parents may mean this is the last time you see your Hex. The last day working with 2. The last time you see Izzy. This is no small potatoes. The full weight of Thudico may come crashing down on you, and you need to be ready. I can't imagine what would have come of you if you hadn't told me, if I hadn't offered to come along," he said, passion and pity making a cocktail which Moss could hardly stomach. "I know, man. This is all just so much," Moss said, as deflated as he had ever heard his own voice. "I don't mean to bust your chops. It's just that you don't seem to fully appreciate the magnitude of the situation," his friend said, and put a reassuring hand on Moss's shoulder. "I do. It's all just so new to me," he said, wishing he'd stopped drinking after one beer. His already confused mind now drenched in a heavy fog. "It's about to get a lot newer," Gibbs said, and gave his shoulder a squeeze. Moss asked, "Are we crazy?" "Oh yes," Gibbs nodded with a wicked smile. "So, let's go be crazy." Gibbs threw on a backpack and ushered Moss out of the Hex before he had time to doubt himself again. They made their way to the elevators and down to the first floor, trying not to stumble as they passed company shops full of people buying clothes, electronic toys, and upgrades for their hexes. Employees sat around in coffee shops, bars, and restaurants. Most of the overheard conversations were about the security lockdown. Every person had their own theories as to what happened. The place was abuzz with nervous gossip. Moss felt superior to everyone, knowing the grand secret that was on everyone's lips. Gibbs watched all the idle chatter, making his peace with the idea of never stepping foot in the burb again. Digital maps and projected arrows pointed the way toward the terminal, and Moss couldn't help but smirk at the posters of smiling employees sitting on the white sand beach in Sea Dome. The terminal walls were covered with alternating advertisements for the various dome options: mountain climbing, winter wonderland, ancient ruins, and steamy jungles, all places Moss had heard mentioned and never been. Light rail trains came and went with dizzying speed, hurrying employees and their luggage to the exotic destinations. The two followed the paths to the platform to Shuttle Base 6, the nearest departure point. A train pulled in mere moments after they arrived, and they stepped aboard, found seats, and lowered the safety bars over their shoulders. As the bars clicked into place, Moss was confined in a way he had never experienced, and as the train pulled away from the station, the force of the movement made him instantly nauseated. As it glided silently forward, he felt as though his organs were being pressed against the inside of his skin, trying to force their way out of his body. He could feel his face flush, and the tips of his fingers tingle. Looking around, no one else seemed the slightest bit bothered, mostly chatting with one another or watching the screens at the front and back of the compartment. "I'm Marisol May, and these are some of the vacation trends this season," the Unreal woman said. And despite himself, Moss tried to picture her life off camera. It did not work anymore, and he just watched the display and tried to keep from vomiting. If you are in the mood for adventure, Thudoko has you covered. Hop on a train to Castle Dome. There you will be transported to a magical world where you can live out your fantasy of being a knight, maiden, or even a king or queen. Ride real horses, camp out under the stars, or learn to fight with swords. You might even meet a dragon. You can have it all in Castle Dome. Spots are limited, so book your room now. Your adventure awaits. If you are more in the mood to relax this season, may I recommend... And the screen paused as the train pulled slowly into the next station. Gibbs nudged Moss, who stood slowly on uneasy feet. "You all right? Is it like the elevators?" he asked. "Yeah, I don't know how you all stand it," he remarked. "I suppose you just get used to it," he said, leading Moss off the train. "I have to stop here," he said, pointing at a restroom, and as the beer had caught up with Moss as well, he nodded his agreement. After a quick stop, Gibbs led Moss out of the tunnel and up some stairs. The air turned cold as they ascended into the massive port with one open-air mall. Rain pounded the circular glass roof, which reflected the light from the many screens indicating directions toward the hovercabs. Moss followed his friend as a child follows their parent to the line for cabs, and they queued behind a family. One kid lay slung upon his mom's shoulder, while another kept slapping the tags on an upright luggage bag. "Please stop that," the mother admonished, looking exhausted. "I want you to be good when you see your father." It occurred to Moss for the first time that not everyone lived a life contained within the burb. His life had been so thoroughly contained it surprised him that others lived differently. And once again he wondered if he was too foolish to do what he was about to do. Several green lights turned on near shuttles, and they made their way toward an empty one. The doors opened, and a screen with options lay in front of the seats. The shuttle was off yellow, with a red cherry light on top, a long bright light at its front, and boosters all along its base. The heat coming off it was jarring, and Moss was uneasy stepping aboard the hovering vehicle. They seated themselves and entered the destination. "This is not a recommended locale. May we suggest the shops at Embarcadero?" A voice came through the speakers. Gibbs hit cancel and entered long-legged spinners again. "This is not a recommended locale. May we suggest the bars at Nueva Stonestown?" Gibbs grumbled and went through the motions again. "This is not a recommended locale. Would you like to continue?" He pressed yes. "Any damage taken by this vehicle will be added to your bill. Do you accept?" "Accept." And the cab jolted as it lifted further from the ground. Moss and Gibbs left their fluorescent and white world for one of neon and black. Part 2. Chapter 6. The cab cleared the rim of the terminal, and darkness filled the vehicle as thudding water hammered the roof and streaked the windows. For as sickening as the train had been, the smooth glide of the hovercab didn't bother Moss at all. He looked out the window as the glistening, white-stacked circles of the burbs grew smaller. He was awestruck by how many there were, all connected by the light rail to one another as well as the terminals and domes. It's so big, Moss said, almost as though the thought just wanted to jump from his lips. That's what she said, Gibbs joked, and Moss groaned audibly as the cab banked and the complex disappeared from view. Awestruck, he murmured. I had no idea. The complex is massive. There are over 100 burbs in the headlands. Thudoko owns this entire district of the city, and there are complexes like this in almost every city around the world. How many cities are there? Moss asked, never having thought about it before. B.A. City was all he had ever heard mentioned except when reading about the wars. No idea. I know there are 3 along the coast and a couple more to the east. I've never thought to ask, Gibbs explained. Each city has its own local government, but from what I hear, they're all pretty powerless. Intercontinental companies like Thudoko pretty much make the rules. Moss thought about it, running his hand over his chin absent-mindedly. I guess if you feed all the voters, you can pretty well control the people they vote for. Exactly, Gibbs agreed as the cab turned and the city came into view. Whoa, Moss said, astonished. Through the rain-streamed window, he saw towers of stacked lights stretching over hills into the distance. An eerie glow pressed against the black night. Spotlight beams swayed back and forth over the seemingly endless series of rectangular skyscrapers. The orbital billboards, hollow projected figures and massive screens shone ads down upon the inhabitants. Moss stared as the lights of the city grew closer, and he saw that most of the lights were coming from individual windows in the buildings. Oh, how many people live here? He asked in disbelief. This is only the tip of the iceberg. The city keeps going for 50 miles. With a population of 50 or 100 million or something like that, most people live in massive apartment buildings or just on the streets. The few elites left on this planet live at the tops of these buildings or in massive compounds all their own, he said, sounding to Moss as though he was repeating what some tour guide had told him. He was astounded that so many people, so many lives existed so close to him, and he had no idea of it before now. That's incredible. The sheer size of it? Why do you think we have to grow so much pea root? Gibbs asked, a note of mockery in his voice. It's unbelievable, he said, not paying Gibbs much mind. They flew over a massive open-air night market. Seemingly endless rows of neon-lit, tarp-covered stalls with racks of clothes, smoking food stalls, and cheap electronics stretched into the night. People milled about, unbothered by the rain. Moss watched their small forms move between stalls like the termites around the panels his drudge repaired. In an instant, it was behind them as they floated higher and into the city itself. Towers rose all around them as the cab moved between tunnels which connected the buildings and into a land of slow-moving traffic. Hollow ads the size of the skyscrapers moved and flashed products. Rings of condensation formed around the hands that Moss had pressed against the inside of the window as he gawked. He could not see the ground. The base of the city was so far from their elevated position. People were everywhere, in every window, smoking on balconies, having poolside drinks on the partially roofed plazas that connected the buildings. The cab stopped, red brake lights from the car in front flooding the space, shifting with the rain. Moss watched below as a drudge, dressed in a tuxedo, strode over to a group of people and offered them a plate of some food he did not recognize, but which looked unmistakably fancy. One man picked something off the tray and popped it in his mouth before instantly spitting it back into his hand and throwing it at the drudge. The other people all laughed as he said something. The red emptied from the car and they moved forward, both their heads snapping toward the front windshield as they pulled up to a stoplight, which illuminated a green arrow pointing down, and the cab dropped. Moss's stomach lurched, and he felt all its contents sear the back of his throat. He cupped his hands over his mouth and swallowed hard as the cab slammed to a stop above the ground, sending the garbage that littered the street flying in every direction. Gibbs was in no better shape as an electronic voice came through the speakers. "You have reached your destination. Please exit the vehicle rapidly, and have a nice day," it said as the two fumbled for their buckles. Gibbs stumbled from the cab like a drunk, and Moss attempted to stand but struck the slick concrete, lights flashing up at him from the puddles. The sound of laughter, loud talking, and electric pounding music flooded his ears as rain pounded his back. He shivered as he vomited into the street. Gibbs came around to pull him up as the heat of the cab lifting skyward scorched his soaking body, steam gusting all around them. They both looked around to take in the scene and get their bearings. "This way," Gibbs said, gesturing to a web of lights Moss could barely make out through the rain dripping down his face. He had never in his life been happier to have his friend by his side. He wiped his face and looked across the street to see the long-legged spinner. The name was projected in moving letters on the facade above a huge spiderweb of neon-red lights. Projected black widows skittered about the web. Windows faced the street, in which men and women danced in suggestive lethargy. "See the breasts on her?" Gibbs pointed as they crossed the street, but Moss had already noticed them. But the people in the windows were unnatural creatures. The women had massive augmented breasts with waists so thin as to hardly contain a spine, legs so long as to be half their height, and cartoonish eyes which stared into nothingness. The men were taller than any Moss had ever seen, with long torsos containing too many abdominal muscles, leading to humongous pecs and broad, strong shoulders. They sported permanent erections that they would point in the direction of passers-by. "Relief aids?" Moss asked as they gaped from under an awning. Gibbs shook his head. "No. They are genetically and surgically altered to meet the needs of a specific clientele." "Oh," Moss replied as he watched a woman absently gyrate in a glowing thong and pasties. "What are we doing?" "Only one way to find out," Gibbs answered, though the question had been rhetorical. They turned to walk toward the door, but were stopped by a nearby group of people who had been leaning on motorcycles and smoking. 3 men and a woman, all dressed in leather pants with military-style jackets adorned with fearsome-looking patches, formed a wall before them. "What do we have here?" the tall, broad leader of the crew asked threateningly. The woman, on whose vest was written prospect rather than a name, wasted no time in excitedly answering, "Looks like a couple of fucking bubs," she snarled. "Well, I'll be," the leader said as he moved toward them, fists clenched. He stared at the two of them, unblinking like a coiled snake about to strike. A man to his right pulled a short length of chain from a pocket and began wrapping it around his knuckles as the woman slid a dirty length of pipe from her belt. "We don't want any trouble," Gibbs said, holding up hands still dripping from the rain. Moss was rooted to the spot, too terrified even to run. Every question he had about the decision to leave the burb was answered at that moment. Wet, sick, and scared for his life, he was as miserable as he had ever been. "Now, see, that was rude," the leader said to his crew. "He just implied that we was trouble." Gibbs let out a shuddering breath and mumbled, "I didn't mean any offense." "I think you did," the leader said as he moved closer, the words steaming from his mouth. "I think you meant we were trouble." "And maybe we are," he added in a stage whisper. "What do you want?" Gibbs cried as they closed in, boots crunching on the wet pavement. He had acted so tough in the burb, but now that they were out in the real world, Moss realized his friend had been all bluster. "We just want to have a little fun," he said, eyes flaring, and teeth showing red in the light of the web. Moss, like a cornered animal, reached behind his back and produced the kingfisher, pointing it at the woman and squeezing the trigger without thinking. Time froze as all 10 eyes tilted to watch the dart lodge itself in her neck. The woman looked confused for a moment, before her body began to twitch uncontrollably, arms and legs vibrating as if trying to shake themselves loose from her torso. She crumpled to the ground as a wide smile crossed the leader's face. He began laughing uproariously, and his goons followed suit. "She was taken down by a fucking bub," he hollered as he clapped a hand on one of the other men's back. After a moment, he stopped laughing and turned a deadly eye to Moss, shaking arms still outstretched. "That was a mistake." Moss could not believe what he had just done. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body did nothing. They stepped closer and Moss braced himself. He had never been hit, never felt physical pain except when he twisted his ankle as a child. But his mother would not be able to pick him up and tell him it was okay this time. He might not even find out about his parents. All this could have been for nothing. The leader wheeled his arm back. White light. For just a moment, it blinded all of them and was accompanied by an electronic pop. Moss had never heard a sound like it before, and he blinked his eyes back to the world. The leader furrowed his brows. "What the fuck?" he began, but his jaw hung slack, and smoke poured from the orifice. A perfect line bisected his face from the upper part of one cheek to the bottom of the other, and the top half of his face slid ever so slightly to the side. His body fell to the street, sending half his head bouncing into the road before landing upright in a puddle, flared eyes still staring at Moss. Pumping blood from his body hissed as it was cauterized upon reaching what was left of his face. Gibbs shrieked, and the 2 remaining men turned to see a form emerge from the rain holding a wide black line laser pistol in his left hand. "You two best be moseying," he said to them, his sonorous voice like crushing gravel. They didn't need to be told a second time, on their bikes and roaring away into the night in an instant. The gruff man was on Moss and Gibbs in no time, holstering his pistol. "You Moss?" he asked from under a dripping bulldogger hat. Moss nodded. His mouth could barely be seen when he spoke, hidden by a scraggly beard like an unkempt garden of grey weeds. The whiskers seemed to meld into the ratty fur lining of the long grey duster he wore over what appeared to be a large hump protruding from his back. He looked at them with one narrow dark eye, the other being a black glass dig plate. He appraised them and growled, "We have to go." "We're meeting someone," Moss protested through trembling lips. "Ina, I know, but she's held up and Courser Corp will be on us right quick," he informed them impatiently as he grabbed their jackets and manhandled them toward an alley. Just then, a soft buzz filled the air as 2 drones dropped from the dark sky above, with scanners making grids on the street. "Cocksuckers," the old man said as he released the 2 and slid the jacket from his shoulders. It exposed a metal box that was fused to his spine, part of it jutting through a slit carelessly cut in his vest. It was military-grade headwear, but if he had acquired it new, those days were long gone, rust and blood mixing where metal met flesh. He manipulated some commands on a cybermesh palm screen, and small flares fired from his back toward the drones, leaving streams of white smoke in their wake. The drones bobbed out of the way like fighter jets, avoiding anti-aircraft fire as he continued to tap at his palm. "Got you," he muttered as the palm screen flashed green before displaying a view from one of the drones, which he controlled to fly directly into the other. A firework of plastic and metal exploded above the street, causing cars to swerve and crunch into one another. The dancers in the windows watched as the drone carcasses rained onto the street below. People called out and screamed as the old man looked at the 2 and said, "Let's go." In a flash, he had picked his jacket off the ground and was off running, Moss and Gibbs following closely as he ducked into a trash-filled alley. They dodged bags, dumpsters, and what appeared to be sleeping people as he guided them into the dark, their way lighted by little more than seedy storefronts, whose yellow light pushed out against the black. They reached the door to a cement building which stretched endlessly into sky, and the old man pressed his soaking palm against a screen. The door beeped and stuttered open just enough for them to squeeze through. He manually closed it from the other side, with a handle crudely soldered to the door. "You idiots cost me a lot of hardware." "You got the chip?" he panted. "Yes," Moss answered, holding forth the small item which had so changed his life. He looked as though he was being offered a bag of cat shit. "I don't want it," he stated. Moss quickly shoved it back in his pocket. "Who are you?" Gibbs asked. The man groaned. "I could ask you the same thing," he said coldly, reaching into a pocket and producing an unlabeled, grimy bottle which he put to his lips. The smell of the alcohol filled the tiny space. The liquid trickled from the side of his mouth into his beard as he glugged. "They call me Byrne," he said, holding the bottle to them. Moss shook his head, but Gibbs took a quick swig and winced. "That'll wake you up in the morning, boy," Gibbs said before coughing. Byrne smirked. "Let's get upstairs and learn you," Byrne said as he returned the bottle to his pocket and headed up the stairs. Faint sounds of scratching could be heard from within the apartments, and a foul smell increased the higher they went. They plodded up the stairs for what felt an eternity before reaching a landing with a boarded-up door. Byrne pushed it open and led them down a carpeted hallway of flickering lights. Small white feathers danced underfoot, and as they passed an open door, it was made clear. The apartment was stacked with cages full of chickens quietly clucking and pecking about. Byrne turned over his shoulder to see their eyes. "Not everyone likes that stuff," he informed them as he ran his palm over what looked to be a misaligned brick. A wall panel creaked open, and he ushered them into a small room, the sounds of scratching coming in from all sides. Moss grimaced as he saw an old couch, more duct tape than fabric, a rusted electric oven with a single pan atop, a sink green with algae, and a lamp which Byrne turned on with a wave. "Janitor's space from before these were the coops," he muttered as he pulled a chair off the wall and unfolded it, gesturing for the 2 to sit on the couch. They unnestled some rats as they did, sending black creatures scurrying across the room. Moss yelped. "We're going to have to toughen you up," Byrne said, one unblinking eye staring at the 2 awkward kids on the couch. He lit a long pork brand cigarette and sucked in a lingering drag. "You 2 know why you're here?" He exhaled, smoke spewing from mouth and nostrils. "I was supposed to give that chip to Ina," Moss said, sounding like a child asking about homework. "So, no," Byrne stated more than asked. "Not really. See, here's the thing. I don't really know what this is about or how I'm involved, but she mentioned my parents, and I want to know more, and Gibbs here, you met Gibbs, right? Well, Gibbs here offered to come since I had never been to the city, and so I said yes, even though now I think it would have been better for him to stay. I wanted to know about my parents because I don't really believe what I've been told about them. But now that I'm here, and I saw a person get murdered, well, he deserved it for threatening me. Well, maybe not, but I don't know, I was scared. But now that I'm here, I think maybe I should have just stayed home too and ignored this whole thing. Byrne held up a hand to silence him. Moss felt as though all his nerves were forcing themselves from his mouth.
Guessing gums never got to you,
he asked, raising the brow above his one natural eye. No, Moss answered, pressing his mouth shut after.
Gibbs?
He asked, turning to face him and fixing a cold stare. Gibbs puffed himself up and tried to sound confident.
Yes? You understand what you're into? Better than he does, I think,
he said, hooking a thumb at Moss. Byrne appraised them and grumbled.
Right. You boys are in it now.
In what? Moss pressed.
All right, Byrne said. Here goes. You two work for a company that runs the world. There are several megacorporations: Kingfisher, Repurb, Shuifeng Technologies, Carcer Corp, Daeus Industries, Tomar, D2E, to name a few, but Thudoco is the biggest. They control the food and the power. They sit at the head of the AIC.
He took a drag and was about to continue when Gibbs put in. What's the AIC? Byrne exhaled slowly as if to calm himself.
You fucking bubs need to learn quick when to keep your mouths shut. I was getting to it. The Amalgamated Interests Council is the worst-kept secret in the corporate world. All the big companies meet to make sure they keep people spending a lot of money while making little. With monopolies in their various industries, they no longer fear one another and they can work as one. A few times a company got uppity and tried to move on another's business, the council sorted it. Scraps and subsidiaries folded into the rest. The mayors are little more than exalted marionettes, kowtowing to the council's every whim. These representatives of the people are royal families for all intents. They all stay rich while we stay poor, slaves agreed. Anyone who had been left in the middle after the wars were sent to colonize the Great Black.
He seemed to conclude, lighting another cigarette. But we aren't slaves, we are employees, Moss said, resenting the implication. He believed Thudoco had lied about his parents, but wasn't ready to hear what Byrne was saying.
That's so,
Byrne asked, smirking patronizingly.
Yeah, Gibbs agreed. We are paid.
Byrne chuckled.
How much money you got, Moss?
I've saved over 200,000 DLI, he stated with pride.
Would it surprise you to learn? That's worth less than 1,000 in real-world money. Couldn't afford a month in this room for that,
Byrne said through the smoke hanging under the brim of his hat. He pressed on his palm and projected the conversion rate. Moss and Gibbs sat in stunned silence, mouths agape.
It's why they give you a vacation stipend when you come into the city, so you never find out how truly broke you are. You try to quit, uproot your life, and move out of the burb, you find out right quick that they have you over a barrel.
He stared at the numbers, his eyes wide and open for the first time. Evil, Moss finally said. Ina called the company evil, but... He trailed off and slumped back, the water from his soaked clothes seeping into the fabric. It was hot in the building, and he had been too distracted by the action to remember how wet he was. But at this moment he felt drowned. Byrne gave him a pitying look.
But you didn't want to believe it.
No, Moss acquiesced. He let out a deep breath as he turned over all the things he had learned in his mind.
Neither did your parents,
Byrne told him, the statement like a thunderclap. Moss looked at Byrne, less surprised than he would have expected. You knew them?
I did. They helped to start all this.
Oh, what? Gibbs inquired before quickly covering his mouth with his hands, his inquisitive nature having gotten the better of him once more.
We're getting to the meat of it now,
Byrne began, but the two young men said nothing this time.
I met your parents when they came to visit your grandmother. She and I served together, and were living in the same government-subsidized shithole. They were like you in a lot of ways, unaware of the world outside the burb, though your dad had lived in the real world, until he was old enough to work for Thudoco. That all changed when your father got promoted to level 5. He started coming around less, leaving your mom to care for her mother-in-law. When he did show up, he looked scared, defeated. When your grandma passed, he couldn't even get the time off to attend her funeral. That was the breaking point. He got a pass to come into the city and track me down. He told me he suspected that the company was getting into some shadowy shit, and he wanted help to get it out. I knew some people, so I obliged. As he got deeper, it seemed as though the company caught wind. He became paranoid, always looking out for the other shoe to drop. I guess they finally caught up with him because he dropped off. Never heard from him again until this month.
What happened? Gibbs blurted, enraptured. Moss punched him hard on the shoulder. Shut up!
Sorry,
Gibbs said, rubbing the spot.
You've got your grandma's fire, kid, I'll tell you that. Noticed it when you shot that biker. It was that killer instinct. You looked like a man possessed,
Burns said, the ash from his cigarette bouncing precariously with the words. Moss agreed. That is how he had felt. His body had moved, had done the action almost independently from his mind. Moss had always known there was a little fire inside him. This instinct. But he had never truly felt it in action until that moment. What can you tell me about her? Moss asked, snatching one question from the river rushing through his mind.
Sandra. She was tough. Never took shit from no one in the war.
He snorted a laugh.
Type of broad you thought was going to get you killed on the daily. But never got hit herself. Pulled me single-handedly from the line when I got shot in the back and recommended me for this.
He knocked a knuckle on the box jutting from his spine.
She wanted better for her son and encouraged him to move to the burb. I know it was hard for her to watch what happened to him, to see him become like the dredges he programmed. She loved her mom, too, her zest, her smarts. Your mom was a firebrand, too. Helped us a lot in those early days. She never lost that light, even when your father faded to black.
Burns smiled far away, lost in memories.
What happened a month ago?
Gibbs peeped, curiosity superseding fear.
We got a message, pre-programmed,
Burns said as he tapped at his palm again, and a new projection appeared before them, rippling in the smoke. Moss's hands went numb, as the face of his father appeared as a hazy apparition. He looked gaunt, unnervous, drenched in sweat with deep bags under his eyes. It was a version of the man which Moss could not remember, but which clearly existed. Burn, I'm recording this during the alpha stage, and if you're receiving it before we talk, that means they got me. I've coded this message to be triggered and sent when Phase 1 of testing begins. When that happens, a data chip here, a map of a server room appeared next to him, will be uploaded with all the information and available for extraction. It will have everything you need to expose Thudiko. It won't be easy to get, and there is no one I can trust to get it out to you. So it'll be up to you. And Burn, if you're seeing this... His face turned grave, more serious than Moss had ever seen. Get Moss out. Promise me. Get him out. Show him the truth. Don't let these bastards do to him what they did to me. Promise me, he pleaded. Moss's eyes grew wet. Heart pounded against his ribs, fists clenched. He wanted to reach out, hug his father one more time, though at this moment he felt as though he had never known the man. He heard the words before thinking them. I'm out, Dad. Chapter 7. Gibbs put a damp arm around Moss, filling him with a warmth which the video had drained from him. The projection was over, leaving scratching and smoke.
We're going to do it for him. Whatever's on that chip, we are going to show the world,
Byrne assured him. Moss heard grim determination hard in his own voice. Yes.
The chip will be encrypted, so we will need to get it into some capable hands,
Byrne stated. You can't do it? Moss asked, looking at the palm screen hopefully. Byrne answered with such finality as to make Moss feel instantly foolish.
No.
I'm cold, Gibbs added. And for the first time, Moss noticed that their clothes were lightly steaming in the warmth of the room.
We will get you new clothes, Byrne said. It won't do much for you if those drones cut your faces. But maybe it will help with the Legion MC. Those bikers are unforgiving. We have much to do and little time if the company is beginning testing.
What are they doing? Gibbs asked, seemingly despite himself. Byrne groaned.
If I knew,
he began, but Gibbs cut in. Right, you wouldn't need the chip.
Let's get you boys cleaned up. Try to get that chip into the right hands before sunup,
Byrne said, standing and stamping out another cigarette, leaving another black spot on the already polka-dotted floor. Where are we going? Moss asked as he stood.
Get you some new duds.
Something with auto-dry? Gibbs asked hopefully.
We're not made of money, kid, he said, and pulled his pistol, running a thumb over the battery display to check its life. We're also going to need to get you to something with a little more bite.
That was my first time firing a weapon, Moss put in.
No shit. Byrne rolled his eye. You'll be learning a great many new skills before too long.
Moss felt a slight smile cross his lips. Of that I have no doubt.
I could eat, Gibbs added, almost pleading. You could stand to lose a few. Byrne gestured to his gut. But we'll get something in you.
Anything but chicken, Moss joked. And Byrne snorted a laugh.
You couldn't afford it anyway,
he said, muttering something under his breath and jamming his pistol away.
Let's go.
They left the room and made their way down the hall, passing an obese man wearing nothing except boots, gloves, and a plastic leather apron. A Hessian bag leaking bird scratch bounced on his shoulder. He grunted in their direction, but no one spoke a word. Moss stole a glance over his shoulder at the man's fat, furry backside, and, as he had so often with Marisol May, he wondered what that man's life was like. At the bottom of the stairs, they stepped back into the rain. The pounding, ceaseless rain. Byrne looked cautiously in both directions and led them down another alleyway. Every building they passed had stairs leading up and down to solid floors fronted with metal grates. Byrne was moving them quickly, every step squishing water between Moss's toes. He was soaked through such that he felt as though he would never be warm again. The aroma of food cooking over open flames filled their noses, and light danced on the walls as the alley eventually opened to another market. Not dissimilar from the one they had passed flying in, this one seemed to stretch farther than he could see. It was built at the base of a crumbling freeway overpass, which sheltered it from the rain. People had to push past one another through the narrow spaces between the stalls, as the actual paths were littered with rickshaws, drawn by thin, miserable people with sunken faces. A gaunt woman spoke to them from underneath the brim of a wide triangular hat, signaling for them to take a ride. Byrne waved her off and snarled something in a language Moss did not recognize. He was uneasy as they moved through the crowds. There were so many people. More people in this one market than in all of Burb 2152. Gibbs was taking it all in, too. Moss observed his friend watching the bustle, smelling the scents and inspecting the transactions. He seemed transfixed by the activity, staring as two women screamed at one another, hands waving and fingers pointing, walks of vat meat and vegetables sizzling as they were flipped and stirred. Shady characters lifting cloths to reveal augmentations for sale, from single fingers or eyes all the way to legs or spines. It was all on offer. Byrne pulled a flap open on a stall, and their eyes were met with a sea of clothing. Rows upon rows upon rows of racks. Tables stacked with hats, shelves stuffed with shoes.
Just pick some shit, quick,
Byrne said, glancing around. Moss knew that the man's digiplate was doing most of the work, scanning the space and keeping a lookout. Moss pulled a black shirt from a rack, the long-forgotten name of a band called Pocket Fluff embossed on the front. He moved to a box of jackets and picked up a trench coat as well.
This place is amazing, Gibbs said,
happily rifling through shirts. Moss chuckled and shook his head. You would love this place.
You are not wrong, he said, giddy with excitement. Look at all this. Vintage doesn't even begin to describe it. Like time stood still. It's awesome.
Moss tried to internalize some amount of his friend's enthusiasm, but failed. You realize two groups of people want us dead, to say nothing of Thudico.
I'm not too worried with him around, Gibbs said, pointing at Byrne but not looking up from the racks of shirts.
He just killed a man, Moss hissed, those eyes from the puddles still staring at him in his mind.
Good, Jerk deserved it. Who knows what they had planned for us? I'm just relieved we hooked up with him so quickly. Who knows if that chick ever made it to meet with us,
Gibbs said. Ina, Moss replied, and pushed through a narrow passage between the racks to Byrne, who was standing near the entrance. Have you heard from Ina?
Huh?
Byrne asked, looking lazily up from the bottle he was nursing.
I have a call out. We'll know more once we meet up with the others, but don't worry, she knows what she's doing. That idiot Chicken Thumbs, on the other hand, bet you anything he stepped right in it.
He was supposed to talk with me first, right? Moss asked.
We gave him the fucking easiest job, said he was ready for the big time. Guess he learned.
You think he's dead? Moss gulped.
Maybe,
Byrne replied, in an unsettlingly cavalier tone. He was so flippant about the potential death, uninterested in the fate of a person Moss took to be Byrne's friend. He had never met anyone like that. In the burb, death was inevitable, though delayed for many, and taken very seriously. Until today, death had been little more than a vague notion. When he had been told of his parents' death, he had been too young to fully understand it, but out here, with Byrne, life seemed cheap. It was a difficult notion to shake.
"You worried about him?"
he asked bluntly. But there was something in his tone which left Moss feeling mocked. Moss couldn't help but answer honestly. If he died trying to find me, then yes.
"You bubs really are like children," Byrne said. "If he got himself killed, he got himself killed. Weren't your fault nor mine, just his and whoever pulled the trigger."
Moss did not answer, just mulled the words over.
"Now get some clothes. We don't have all fucking night to stand around here jawing. And tell Chubbs he's got 5 minutes before he finds a boot in his anus."
He ran over to Gibbs, who turned on him with a grin, holding up a white shirt frilled at the front and along the sleeves. "But I don't want to be a pirate," he said, in mock imitation of something which Moss did not understand. "Byrne says we have to hurry," he said, his tone conveying the message clearly. Gibbs hustled to pull a flannel shirt off the rack before moving on toward heavy jackets, Moss right behind. Within a few minutes, they both had armfuls of attire and were standing before Byrne, who brought them over to an ancient man sitting in a plastic chair behind a cluttered counter, his face blue with the light of an ancient, decrepit television. He wearily rang up the items before Byrne spoke.
"They're going to change in the flaps. You torch what they leave."
The old man nodded, appearing neither to have listened nor heard. In a flash, Byrne sent a cigarette butt rocketing toward the old man, who had just time enough to slap at the embers as they burst upon his chest. He cursed at Byrne, who simply repeated,
"Torch what we leave."
"Yes, yes," the old man grumbled, as Byrne ran his palm past a small scanner to pay.
"Go change,"
Byrne ordered, and the two pushed into cramped stalls with a cloth hanging from copper rings which scraped across a steel bar. They stripped slowly out of the clothes which clung to them. With nothing to dry themselves, they put the new items on their damp flesh, shivering all the while. Moss noticed a small camera pointing into the changing area and grimaced. "Creep," he said to no one in particular.
"I see it too," he heard from the adjacent stall. "I always assumed the Hexes had cameras too, despite the company's claims."
That thought had never occurred to Moss, who had always taken Thudico at their word. The idea unnerved him greatly. You think?
"Yeah, probably. What we've learned tonight only bolsters that notion."
"You may be right," Moss had to concede, remembering Izzy's claim that she knew what he wanted to do with her, and feeling the pang of guilt once more. He imagined a group of security officers laughing at him and calling her over to watch as he awkwardly defiled his friend. Her imagined face in horror as she was made to stare at the sordid incident.
"You about ready?"
Gibbs asked as Moss pulled the bulky, water-resistant jacket over his shoulders. "Yes," he answered, sliding open the curtain. He took one last look at the sopping pile of burb clothes and headed for Byrne, who was still arguing with the man behind the counter. He led them from the shop toward a section thick with smoke. Crude fires lit with charcoal heated a sea of pots and skillets. They made their way to a young man covered in sliding tattoos who looked lazily up at them. He wore a tattered, oversized Kampf brand wife-beater with the company logo on the front nearly faded to oblivion. The pockets of his baggy pants were filled to bursting, and Moss could not even venture a guess as to what was in them. The kid seemed utterly disinterested in their very presence. "Help you?" he asked, glassy-eyed.
3 meat bowls with everything,"
Byrne ordered, tapping on his palm screen. 3, he repeated as he grasped for bowls.
3,
Byrne hissed as the kid laid them out in what felt like a frame-by-frame video. He heaped noodles into the bowls. "Soup?" he asked, the word as lethargic as his movements.
"Everything,"
Byrne said, not looking up as the kid ladled in steaming broth. "Shoots?" he asked. Moss began to fret for the young man's safety as Byrne raised an eyebrow and seethed, "Everything!" The kid was unfazed, topping the bowl with shoots. "You said meat, right?" Moss held a delicate hand over Byrne's hard, calloused hands, reaching toward his pistol. The action surprised him, as he was scared of the man. But he was even more scared of what would happen if he cold-cocked the kid.
"Don't fucking touch me,"
Byrne warned. But his tone was betrayed by a peculiar smile. "He's not worth what will come," Moss said, retracting a trembling hand, still surprised with himself. Since leaving the burb, it was as if instinct had replaced logic. "Yes, meat," Gibbs said to the kid, who had taken no notice of the scene unfolding before him. Moss marveled as he heaped meat onto the bowls. This young man had no idea how close he came to a world of pain or worse. A tattoo of a woman riding a nuclear bomb winked at Moss as the cook reached for sauce, before looking up with a questioning look. Moss shouted, "Add the sauce!" "Whatever, asshole." The young man pouted, and there was no stopping Byrne this time. He grabbed the kid by his scruffy black hair. Now he was paying attention. "You're a fucking generation," he said to Moss, as though it were his fault, before turning on the cook. "Listen, fuckwit. When you have a customer before you, that is your whole fucking world, you hear me?" "I hear you," he said, with venom coated in terror. Byrne released the kid and threw an ancient cash chip at him. "It's more than you deserve," he snarled, and scooped up a bowl and 2 sticks from a jar. The 2 followed suit. "Prick," Gibbs added, before trotting after Byrne. "I've never said that to someone before," he whispered to Moss. Moss shook his head, his heart racing. That brief interaction was more intense than just about anything he had experienced in the burbs. Gibbs had a little smirk on his face. Moss scoffed. "I can't believe how much you are enjoying all this." "You only get one go, Moss. We may not have much longer given all this. I'm gonna experience it, live it while I can. Those bikers come back and," he snapped his fingers, "it could all be over. So I'm gonna eat, drink, buy clothes, shoot guns, do whatever." Moss knew there was truth to what he said, a hard, unfathomable truth. "You should take a page. Live while you're living," Gibbs concluded with a wink. Moss nodded and considered the words as the 3 sat in what he imagined was once a park. A large plaza with cement benches covered in small spikes to prevent sleeping, fire pits and lighted posters under a tall overpass that was shaking under the weight of cars. People sat about eating, talking, and sleeping while others made rounds, performing tricks or playing music with open hands. The beggars stayed well clear of them, Byrne obviously not giving the impression of generosity. A small enclosed playground sat off to one side, packed with unattended children. The gates, structures, and fencing were all branded with operatic Wealth Network logos. The company had undoubtedly donated the small space to curry favor with the citizenry. Moss had noticed that almost every building, structure, or piece of beautification bore one corporate logo or another. As they sat in silence, eating and slurping, a cat wandered over. One of its hind legs was a crude but functional mechanical version. The cat leisurely circled, mewing for scraps, the robotic leg working in perfect harmony with the others. Moss cocked his head at the animal as it clicked around his leg, nuzzling and beginning to purr. Who would put that on a stray? "Who cares?" Byrne replied, finishing his meal. "Just seems like an odd use of the parts," he noted, watching the little critter as it made its way to Gibbs' feet, popping its little head up one pant leg. Moss dropped a small scrap of meat from his bowl to the ground, immediately getting the animal's attention. It sprang over and began licking at the imitation meat. Byrne snorted. "Feed him and he's likely to follow you around forever." "I'll take all the friends I can," Moss joked without thinking. "Friends and followers ain't the same," Byrne pointed out, but Moss was hardly listening, fixated on the movement of the small animal. It was so similar to the way the tiger in the burb moved, skulking and lapping at the proffered meat. The rusted metal against the dirty orange fur made it hard to distinguish the leg in certain lights as the cat moved. Moss smiled, forgetting for a brief moment where he was and what he was doing. "Shit," Byrne groaned, and both Moss and Gibbs looked up to see 6 people coming around a corner into the plaza. They wore the unmistakable vests of bikers, with the same horizontal sword emblem they had seen earlier that night. Moss turned to Byrne, who appeared to be calculating his next move. "We have to get the fuck out of here." "Oh no," Moss squeaked and leaped to his feet. "Slow up," Byrne hissed. "These lot may not know what you look like, so let's move out slow." He stood as he sent a message on his palm. They all turned away and began making their way back toward the narrow walkway. People bustled quietly, and a couple moved to sit on the vacated bench. Moss felt the throbbing of his heart and stole a glance over his shoulder. One biker caught his eye. "I think they see us," Moss whispered in a tremulous voice. His feet began to move more quickly, though he tried to hold his pace. "We're fine," Byrne whispered. But Moss could see he was unsure and had his hand buried in his jacket. They were nearing the street, the sea of people in which to get lost a mere 10 paces before them. Pop. The sound of gunfire was unmistakable, and the screaming began immediately. Byrne was pushing them through the running bodies as he pulled his Kingfisher from its holster and turned his plated eye back just long enough to get a shot off. The white light filled the space, and a different scream echoed behind them. Not one of fear, but anger and pain. As they entered the fleeing throng, Moss stole a glance back to see a man grasping at seared flesh, feeling for an arm that lay next to him on the street. The beam had sliced him from collarbone to ribs. Moss stared at the man a moment longer than he should, and tripped as another shot rang out, moving the already fleeing people faster. "Moss!" he heard his friend utter as he turned to see the crimson seeping into the white squares of the flannel on his left arm. He was staring into Moss's eyes as he ran, a vacant look on his face. Moss would never forget the fear and grim understanding he witnessed from his friend at that moment. Gibbs clutched at the wound. The blood began to trickle from between his fingers, slowly filling the creases at the skin of his joints. He was panting as his flesh turned pale. "Gibbs got shot!" Moss yelled to Byrne through the crowd. The old man grumbled an inaudible response. Moss hooked himself under his friend's other arm, helping to take some of the increasing weight. Another shot fired at a distance exploded a street lamp overhead, showering glass down on the crowd. More shouts and shots could be heard as drones dropped from above and zipped toward the perusing thugs, scanning as they moved. Byrne lowered his head as they passed, blue lines skimming over the brim of his hat. Moss held his free hand over his face, pleased that he was already shielding himself from falling debris. "This way!" Byrne shouted as he ducked into a doorway and kicked the entire door off rusted hinges, a muffled hiss and gulp emanating from the back implant. "We can get to them this way. The buildings are connected." "All right," Moss said, looking at Gibbs, who was hardly conscious, eyes bloodshot and glassy under dark bags. Climbing the stairs was slow going, and Byrne eventually took over carrying Gibbs. They reached a landing and made their way down a long hallway of doors, Gibbs all the time dripping on the patchy carpeted floor. Wailing music grew louder as they moved toward a set of open doors, with people partying back and forth between apartments, red plastic cups to match the red faces. The revelers seemed utterly disinterested in the three as they passed. "Dude's messed up," one announced drunkenly, cheap beard dripping from his mutton-chopped face. "You should get him to a vet." A girl by his side slapped him playfully before nearly falling and grabbing his arm. "You mean a doctor?" she shrieked through laughter. The drunken kid joined in the merriment. "I know, right?" he said. The three kept moving. "We're taking him to a hospital?" Moss pressed. "We'll get him patched," Byrne answered, impatient as they reached a walkway between buildings. "Places get quieter farther in." Moving through the endless sea of apartment doors and hallways became increasingly frustrating as Gibbs sank deeper and deeper, hardly clutching the wound any longer. "How you doing, kid?" Byrne asked. "Always one to joke under duress," Gibbs rasped. "Been better?" "Sounds about right." Byrne nodded. "Just about there." "I always like to make an entrance," Gibbs sputtered just before his body contorted and he sprayed vomit on the peeling papered wall, pieces of undigested noodle sliding slowly to the ground. Byrne ran his palm over a screen next to a door, and it opened, revealing an empty room. 4 wood paneled walls with linoleum floors. Nothing. Moss turned to yell at Byrne, who was rapidly tapping at his palm with the fingers from the same hand. Just then, the back wall was no longer wood panel, but a blank screen with a door that slid open. Though he had looked at wall screens like this his whole life, he had never considered that they could be used for clandestine purposes. "Whoa," he uttered. "Cheap trick, but keeps Rentec Building Associates from asking questions," Byrne said as he heaved Gibbs toward the open door. "Trick can't be that cheap," Moss noted, trying desperately to distract himself from the fact that his friend was dying. "We inherited it from an off-the-books porno studio. And his tone shifted, "helped to relocate." "Ah," Moss said, pretending to understand the implication but unsure what exactly he meant. He followed Byrne up a narrow staircase with hardly enough room to drag Gibbs up. An impenetrable-looking door with a machine gun turret and camera awaited them. "Let us in," Byrne ordered into the camera, immediately followed by an electronic click and the sound of someone shifting heavy metal. Chapter 8. They crashed through the door and were greeted by staring eyes and pointed weapons. Seeing the situation, a thin, dark, meticulously clean man in a checkered suit rushed over to Gibbs. He was devoid of any hair and wore lemon-yellow gloves with matching tie. "He's been hit," Byrne announced as he and the thin man helped Gibbs onto a couch. The man began scanning Gibbs, taking vitals and putting bots to work. "Legion's on our ass, and Carcer will be swarming," Byrne added. A beefy Asian man holding a classic revolver asked, "They see you?" "Kid was smart, covered his face, and the other was slumped," Byrne explained. "Good," the man said as he hurried over to pick up Gibbs. For a safe house tucked in between tenement apartments, the space was rather large, though nearly all of it was full of equipment and computers. Cords and power cables snaked around the floors, up the walls, and were even taped to the ceiling where many hung slack, the tape having failed under the weight. Another person eyed them suspiciously from a bank of cots. They were little more than metal frames with canvas bolted to the wall on one side and held flat by rusted chains on the other.
I need a couple of reloads,
Burns said to the person on the cots, who jumped down despondently, eyeing Moss the whole time. Moss stared at the slight frame, nondescript baggy clothes, facial features which Moss considered both masculine and feminine, and those angry eyes. While one side of their head was shaved, the long hair which cascaded down the other was dyed jet black with white stripes. With thick, black tribal tattoos cascading down one arm and tanned skin, they looked to Moss like a Pacific Islander, though he had never met someone from there before. He desperately wanted to say something, justify his presence, but could not muster the words. His mouth simply fell open. A plump, pale Caucasian girl with tattoos covering her face approached him. Bisected at the nose, her face was striped with what Moss took to be code, and the other half hieroglyphs. She wore a maroon shirt, black leather skirt with purple lipstick and eyeshadow. "Rosetta," she said, extending a hand, inked in a language Moss did not recognize. He shook it, but before he could speak, she asked, "You Moss?" "Yeah," he said, looking over her shoulder as Gibbs received an injection. "You have something for me?" she asked kindly, as though speaking to a lost child. Moss hesitated.
She's the one to give it to. She's our breaker,"
Byrne announced as he peeled his jacket from his shoulders. Moss pulled the data chip from his pocket and handed it over. He felt as if his entire purpose in this had already come to a close, and that he had got his friend shot for nothing. "Thanks," Rosetta said with a broad smile before turning and scurrying over to a computer sitting on a desk cluttered with repair supplies, paper coffee cups, and action figures. She inserted the chip into a reader and began working. Byrne sat on a couch as the work commenced on his implant. Moss stood, not knowing what to do. Feeling utterly useless, he made his way across the room to where the man in the suit was pecking at a screen, programming a handheld medical assist bot to remove the bullet in Gibbs's arm. The large man turned at his approach, holding up his hands to stop Moss.
"Your friend is going to be fine," he said with a hint of a drawl, "but let Grimy do his thing."
"Thank you both," Moss said, his sincerity not lost on the man who towered over him.
"It's what we do,"
the man said. He wore tight black pants through which Moss could see the outline of his large penis, and a purple mesh tank top through which the words 100% beef was tattooed across his broad chest. He caught the look.
"I'm all man,"
he said, continuing when he saw Moss's confusion.
"No augments, no implants, nothing. Don't take stems, don't smoke, don't drink coffee, nothing. Parents had me au naturel. I was born in the bathtub, all human ever since. Don't judge all you folks with your robo parts, just ain't for me," he concluded, clearly having given this speech many times before. He ushered Moss to the remaining couch, and they sat. "You get sick a lot?" Moss asked, having always been told that people without genetic inoculations rarely survived past infancy. "Used to, got called Sniffles as a kid because of how much I got sick, but now? Never. My body handles that shit. Nothing you can do in a lab which the human body can't do better."
"Not Sniffles anymore?" Moss sheepishly joked.
"Oh, no, they call me Ferocious Stan, on account of my short temper," he said, and took Moss's hand in one of his strong, massive paws before giving it an introductory shake.
"You don't mind the name?"
Stan grinned. "Nope. I know how I get. Comes in handy in a scrape."
"I'm Moss," he said. And just as with Moss, too, he wished he had come up with a better nickname. "Like Lichen?" Stan asked with a cocked eyebrow. Moss smiled slightly. "You know, I've never heard that one before."
"Got a ferocious wit, too,"
Stan said with a wink. Moss chuckled. "Does it make it difficult to do things?" Moss asked, genuinely curious. They were so dependent on technology in the burbs that he could not imagine living without.
"Being tech-free? Yeah,"
Stan admitted.
"I carry an old-style phone I program like a palm screen, but it does make life harder sometimes."
Moss liked the young man, feeling at ease talking with him, but it struck him that he only seemed a few years older than he was. Ina, too. Looking around the room, the whole lot of them seemed to be under 30. Watching his eye, Stan asked,
"What you see?"
"You're all, well, young," he observed.
"You got that right,"
Stan said with an infectious smile.
"We are. Not all groups are like us. Some are older, been at this for years, but others—"
He trailed off, examining his compatriots.
"Sandra brought us all together. Each one of us was on let's just say an unideal path. She took us in, gave us homes, and showed us we could be part of something."
"What?" Moss asked, wanting to know everything about both his grandmother and the purpose she lay before them. You only been away from the burbs a few hours? Stan asked. Moss felt as though he was admitting some secret shame. Yeah? Well, it'll be hard for you to see, but you've been part of some bad shit for a long time. We all know your family wanted you out, but it may be a while before you understand why we do what we do. Once more, Moss felt like a child. A memory flashed for a brief moment. His father saying, "This is all talk," before ushering him from the room. His father. This man who he no longer felt he knew at all, and about whom so much had been made, had made him feel then just as he did now. "I'm beginning to understand," Moss said, but even to himself the words sounded shallow. Stan put one of the giant hands on his shoulder. "I'm sure." It was a kindness, and it was not lost on Moss. This man, the self-described ferocious man, was being so nice to Moss, and it meant a lot to him. Moss was overwhelmed and scared, for himself and for his friend who was wheezing in the corner. He had made it here on instinct, but now felt as though he could pass out from the weight of it all. But Stan was making it a little easier. The small gesture of a conversation was enough to keep him going. He looked up at the massive man and asked, What was my grandmother like?" Stan chuckled, himself lost in memories. He smiled and pounded his fist against his palm for effect. Hard. Not the type of person you wanted to run into in a dark alley, but under her ass-kicking, ball-busting exterior was a good woman. She helped me when I was lost. Lighted away in dark days. You see, I played ball in school, helped me to get big and tough rather than sick. I got good, real good. Even got a contract from the Miners Football Club, but as happens, I tore my ACL. Stan wasn't looking at Moss as he recounted the story. He seemed to be reliving it through the telling. "Easy fix, right?" he continued. "But I didn't want the drugs, or the mesh where my body should be. So I tried rehab, old-fashioned stretch and lift rehab, but my body never quite came back." He hung his head in the miserable memory. I got cut. I got mad. Living with rage the way some live with booze. Couldn't get right. Started fights just to finish them. Sometimes they finish me, though. He fell silent for a moment before Moss saw a slight glint in his eye. Then I met her. She showed me that I could still make an impact in this world. As I said, she did that for all of us. "I didn't really know her," Moss said, wishing more than anything that he had. "Turns out there was a lot I didn't know about my family." "That's hard. I still spend every Sunday night with my family," he said, not considering his words. "Sorry," he adjusted. "It's all right," Moss said. "I think I'll get to know them better by getting to know you all better." "Right," Stan agreed with a smile. "Let me make introductions." Moss glanced around the room as Stan pointed. No one took note. "You met Rosetta on the way in. She's better with computers than most." "Okay," Moss said. "Working on Burns back is my partner and love of my life, Judy. Former carcer fixer. Before you ask some dumb fuck bub question, the pronoun is they, you follow?" Moss did and had no interest in finding the ferocity, so he turned the conversation. "Everyone has a role?" he asked. "Exactly, just like in your video games," Stan said knowingly. He was more right than he understood. Growing up playing games together, Izzy, Gibbs, and Moss had always built purposeful squads, with Izzy playing as a tank class, Gibbs as a healer, and Moss picking up a more leadership role, putting more points in charisma or intelligence depending on the game. Breaking Moss out of his thoughts, Stan continued. "Most groups of us try to have enough diverse skills to get us out of a jam." "Makes sense," Moss said. "Now, over there," he said, and pointed to the man in the suit. "That's Grimy." They both looked at Grimy as he watched the bot delicately remove the bullet while simultaneously clearing blood away and adding cream. The mechanical arms and tendrils worked in perfect fluid motion, a meticulous ballet of healing. Stan tore his gaze away first and took up the conversation again. "Grimy does most of our patchwork, former vet, veterinarian, that is. Not the other one. Not like Sandra. I don't think he'd hold up too good in a fight." Moss couldn't help but think about the drunks they passed who made a similar distinction. Moss questioned, "He's called Grimy ironically?" Stan tapped a finger to his nose. "Man's fastidious. Never seen a person who likes things so clean. He says he likes things a certain way, but I think he's a little crazy," he said loudly enough for all to hear. Grimy looked over his shoulder at them. "Laugh now, but I'm sure you'll be happy when you do not get an infection." He scowled. His voice was deeper than Moss had presumed based on appearance. Stan laughed. "Guess you got that right." Moss chuckled and was surprised by how light the mood was in the room. A group of young people fighting a giant company who no doubt had bounties on all of them, with one person bleeding out in the corner and another who had recently killed a person getting repaired, and none of them seemed bothered. When we get synced to our network, you'll meet Seti, our Aussie in the sky. Never seen her outside of VR, but she keeps tabs on the goings-on. Helps keep Carcer out of our face. Oh, Moss said, and caught himself looking up before shaking his head of the foolishness. And you know, Byrne. Stan pointed to the man in question. Byrne was engaged in a hushed conversation with Judy. Right, Moss said before adding politely. Seems nice. Stan laughed and whispered, making sure Byrne was not listening. No, he doesn't, but I'd rather be led by a competent asshole than a kind idiot. Sure, Moss agreed, thankful for everything Byrne had done for him so far. What about Ina and Chicken Thumbs? Stan's face grew dark. Right, he said, hanging his head. Ina is a jack of all trades. Tough like Sandra, clever as Byrne, as skilled as Rosetta and Judy. Moss smirked. But not as strong as you. Nah, no one is, he said with a bright grin. She comes close, though. I notice you didn't include me in that list, Grimy put in, as no one compares to me. You just ain't good enough at anything to count, Stan fired back. Little bots of yours do all the real work. Grimy dramatically put his hands to his chest. My delicate psyche, he mocked, before turning serious. While you may think modern medicine is simply dropping a bot, human guidance is still paramount to the success of any operation. Moss offered, like us with our drudges. Precisely, Grimy said with a tip-of-the-hat gesture. I'll be interested to hear how you describe our illustrious Chicken Thumbs, he said to Stan, who shook his head and turned to look at Moss. Here's the thing about CT, he began, considering his words. He wants it. He wants to be good, and he works hard to help. He's not naturally gifted the way some people here are. Not some wonderkind who was in vet school while most kids his age were drawn with crayons. He shot Grimy a withering look. He's just a normal guy who wants to help. I admire him for that. He and I both worked hard, and now we are part of something. Grimy snorted a laugh, and Moss found that he was hardly listening, more concerned at that moment about his friend covered in blood on the couch. He took solace that Gibbs looked better now, rhythmically breathing while the bots skittered over his body, checking for further injuries. Moss felt the weight of guilt upon him. He had been so distracted by the people in the room, the stories of his family and his own role, that he had nearly forgotten that his closest friend had been shot for coming along, for helping, when there was no reason for him to have come along. He could feel his eyes well up as the overwhelming shame took over. The two men took no note, and Grimy said, The difference, Stanley, is that with your hard work you became something more than you were. Chicken Thumbs may want for greatness, but his capacity is limited. Stan shot the man a broad, winning smile. I think he's going to surprise us all. Assuming he's still alive, Grimy stated, before noticing Moss's look. He glanced down at Gibbs. He's going to be fine, he said. This is a rather mild injury, all things considered. Moss had to force words from his lips, his voice cracking as he spoke. He got shot for me. Maybe you shouldn't have fucking brought him, Judy scolded, and the words found their way like an arrow into Moss's soul. Moss looked at them meekly. I tried to stop him. The kid's friend got shot, Jude. Cut him some fucking slack, Stan defended. Someone here needs to speak the truth, Judy said, eyes narrowing at Moss. Grimy gestured to Gibbs. Don't you think he's had enough truth for one day? He's going to need to toughen up quick, and all this coddling isn't helping matters, Judy argued. Moss watched the scene unfold, wide-eyed and miserable. Yeah, but Stan began. Enough, Byrne bellowed, rising to his feet. Judy, let's you and I go for a drink. Stan, get Moss set up on a cot. Maybe read him a bedtime story too, hon, Judy mocked as the door opened and they exited hurriedly. I'm not, Moss began, ire rising within him. I'm not a fucking child. I know. Stan nodded and smiled in a pitying way that made Moss feel worse. Moss turned to the powerful man, affecting as tough a tone as he could muster. Tomorrow, can you teach me to fight? Not really how it works, Stan said. Learning to fight takes years of training and conditioning. You don't simply watch me punch a guy and mimic it. Teach me how to shoot, then, Moss pleaded, and Stan nodded. All right, but you should get some rest. If we get this decrypted, we may need your help sooner than later, Stan told him. Moss nodded and stood, not making his way straight to a cot, but to Gibbs. He watched his friend lay there, doing nothing. But he was alive. I'm sorry, he said. Not for his friend, but for himself. He gritted his teeth. This would not happen again. He would learn to fight, to protect himself and those he cared for. He turned back and slumped onto a cot. The room was bright and loud, and completely unlike where he normally slept. And yet, he did. Chapter 9. Moss opened his eyes, rubbed his implant, and for a moment wondered where the sound of the sea was. The rotted wood which greeted his vision reminded him. He was not in his hex, not in his burb. He was somewhere else altogether, doing something which he didn't understand for reasons he was only beginning to see clearly. He rolled over and the room was dark and mostly quiet. Rosetta still faced the bank of screens, transfixed in her work. Gibbs snored quietly, and there was an impression of a body in the cot above him, sinking low over his head. He blinked and a coffee mug appeared before him, steaming with an unmistakable aroma. Moss had never tried the stuff before, but his head hurt and nothing else was normal, so he figured to give it a shot. He reached out and grabbed the mug as he realized it was Judy who was offering. "Thanks," he whispered as the steam from the mug filled his nostrils. He had always enjoyed the smell of coffee when he had passed the cafes, but never enough to walk in. "No problem," Judy said. "Sorry about before. Not a great first impression." "Nope," Moss agreed, and Judy laughed, zebra hair falling in front of their face. Moss noticed all the freckles Judy had, never having taken the time before to observe. "It's simply that I don't know you, and don't know why everyone is so quick to trust you just because of who your family is." "Fair enough," Moss said, and meant it. He knew these people had no reason to trust him yet, and did not really begrudge them for saying so, though he did not like it either. It's a two-way street. I don't know any of you people either, and I pretty much have to just go with it also. I mean, I'm pretty sure I gave up my whole life for this just because someone told me they knew my parents. I hadn't thought about what you gave up to be here, or what you risked. I am sorry, Judy repeated, and Moss wondered what Byrne had said to inspire this turnaround. Maybe we can both learn to trust each other together? I'd like that, Moss said, and extended a hand, which Judy shook. You ever have coffee before? Nope. Am I going to like it? Probably not. It's an acquired taste, Judy said, their brown eyes kind for the first time since they met. Moss smiled and asked, You ever met anyone from the burbs before? Nope. Am I going to like it? Judy parroted, and they both chuckled quietly. Moss took a sip of the dark brown liquid and winced. The hot brown liquid tasted disgusting to him. Where do you acquire that taste? He joked. But before Judy could answer, Byrne stepped into the light. You two about done mending fences? Judy said, yes, and Moss nodded. Good, he said. Could be a long day, he began, and cut his words short, pressing a finger to his ear. Rosetta turned from the streams of data to her screens, and Judy cocked an ear. Getting this? Byrne asked Rosetta, who nodded, causing all the piercings in her head to bounce. What is it? Moss whispered. But the cots above him were already beginning to shift. Byrne, you want me to piece him or unlock him? Rosetta asked, holding up a physical earpiece. Just unlock him, the thing's in there already, Byrne answered, pointing at Moss and indicating for him to move. He stood and hustled over to Rosetta, making sure to avoid all the cables between them. I'm gonna connect with your implant, Rosetta said. Her tone was still kind, but tired. Sure, Moss said. Long night? She smirked. Yeah. Thuroko usually doesn't make it too hard, but this chip you brought is some deep data. It'll be a while before I get anywhere. This implant, on the other hand, she said, and pointed to the base of his head. He noticed then the cybernetic fingertips under a layer of the same skin mesh which were used in relief aids. She tapped on her keyboard. Moss watched as she got a lock to his implant. How much can they do? He asked, marveling at the ease with which they kept hacking it. A lot, she answered easily, not paying much attention to him. The screen flashed. Download complete. Upload complete. Installation complete. Detritus 16 link established. Diagnostics complete. Hey, new guy. Moss heard the Australian accented voice in his mind. Hi, he said aloud, causing chuckles all around. You can think responses, just like the commands to your room back home, Rosetta clarified. Oh, he thought, and Rosetta shot him a thumbs up. You can all hear my thoughts now? He asked, but realized the answer as the words left his lips. Rosetta chuckled. No, just the ones designated for us. The implant translates your brainwaves the same way as before. You just have a new feature unlocked. Right, Moss said, and turned to Grimy. "How's Gibbs?" "Still recovering, Will," he answered. "Now that I have all of you," Seti interrupted, "I got an encoded message from Ina. It came in garbled, and I won't bother playing it for you. Suffice it to say I heard the word captured, and she hasn't checked in since." No one spoke as everyone processed the information. Seti broke the silence with a joke. "Am I to assume you're all making grim faces at each other?"
"Yes," Burns said. "We'll work on a plan to get her out."
Seti said, "I'll let you know if I hear anything else." "Thanks," Rosetta replied.
"Moss,"
Burns said, and all eyes turned to him.
"Where would someone be taken if they were arrested in the burb?"
"Carcer Corp has an auxiliary holding between the burbs where our security officers take people for transfer," Moss answered. Happy Izzy had explained procedures in excruciating detail while she was at the BurbSec Academy. He remembered the late nights in her hex, flipping cards with detail after detail of Thudoco security. He had never thought it would actually be relevant for his life.
"Think we can get in easily?"
Byrne asked. Moss shook his head before admitting, "I have no idea. Though, really?" Looking around the room, he added, "I guess if anyone can, it would probably be you guys."
"Us guys,"
Stan clarified, looking right at Moss, who could feel his hand begin to shake. "Seti, can you get us schematics?" Judy asked.
"Already on it,"
Seti answered, and a projection of the facility appeared in the center of the room, a perfect, full-color digital rendering. Flanked by burbs on all sides, the octagonal structure of gray metal and concrete was ominous. Brick walls with barbed wire lay only a few meters before chain-link fences. A guard tower overlooked the structure with floodlights and scanners. Drones circled like vultures overhead, and Moss squinted to see two guards in their intimidating gray and red armor playing on palm screens. Moss gasped. "Is this live?"
"Sure is,"
Seti said in an unapologetically braggadocious tone.
"Stan, I want you to get some equipment with Moss while Judy and I workshop a plan,"
Byrne announced.
"Got it, Coach?"
Stan said with a wry smile as everyone began to move about the room. "Actually," Moss said, and everyone stopped dead. All eyes on him once more, he swallowed and said, "I think I know someone who can help us with this." Judy scowled as Byrne asked,
"Who's that?"
With all the eyes now on him, he stammered, "My friend. Well, one of my closest friends. I mean, we grew up together, not that we were close in any other way. Not that I would be opposed to that. I just mean a friend of mine. I should clarify, her parents helped raise me after mine. Well, anyway, she works in security and may be able to help us."
"What did you have in mind?"
Byrne asked. "Why are you humoring this?" Judy hissed. "We don't need another fucking bub involved. We already have this bonus sack of potatoes." Judy hooked a thumb at Gibbs. "We don't need more. Every Thudico employee we bring in puts us at higher risk."
"That may be, but we are up against it, and an inside man may be just what we need,"
Byrne stated. And though Judy seemed to sulk, no more was said. Silence oppressed the room for a moment. "I was thinking she could take some of you guys prisoner or something, and you could break Ina out from the inside," Moss offered, thinking himself very clever until the laughter began. Byrne was not laughing.
"It's a good idea, kid."
His patronizing tone was not lost on Moss.
"But that only works in the movies. If we got taken in, we would be stripped, databased, have our weapons taken, our implants shut off, and would be in as bad a spot as Ina."
"Your plan just means more of us imprisoned," Judy piled on. Moss hung his head in shame. "Sorry."
"Don't be,"
Byrne said.
"I want you to contact your friend and see if they can't help us out. Just not in the way you suggested."
"The way you coddle him is amazing," Judy snorted, reminding Moss much more of the night before than the person he woke up to.
"The only one getting coddled right now is you,"
Byrne said, with a threatening finger pointed square at Judy.
"I know, you're all bent out of shape because your friend's in peril, but you need to inflict this attitude on Carcer and not those fixing to help."
"Fine," Judy conceded, accompanied by a dramatic eye roll.
"Stan, take him to a cafe and to get kitted. Make contact with a friend if you can, but keep him safe. Get back by sundown, because we want to get to Ina before they transfer her to a proper facility and things get a whole lot worse."
"I got you," Stan said, and headed for the door with Moss dogging his steps. He was relieved to be leaving the room, though it put him ill at ease to leave Gibbs with strangers, no matter how well they knew his family. Gibbs was the brother Moss never had, and more his real family were people he never knew. The crotchety old grandmother who sent him a present once a year for his birthday was some rebel leader bringing young people together for a cause. His father, who got home just in time to say goodnight, was a corporate spy trying to take down the company that raised him. He still didn't even know his mother's role in all this, and given everything, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Gibbs had been there for him, had been a friend when he needed one most. Izzy and her family had taken him in, helped him to sort his life out when things were most dire. Moss shook his head, trying to banish the guilt from his mind. One of his friends had been shot for him, and he was about to ask the other to betray the people she most trusted for some person Moss hardly knew. "What am I doing?" he heard himself ask aloud when he and Stan were out in the anteroom. He hoped Stan had not heard, but he turned to face Moss. "You're doing good in a bad world," he put plainly. "I can't imagine what this is like for you, waking up to a normal world one day and an upside-down one the next. Must be hard, brutal. But you seem like a good man and you're going to help people. We don't know what's on that chip, but your dad wanted us to get it out. That means it's some bad stuff, and you're helping with that. You're making your dad proud," he said, with such genuine kindness that Moss wanted to fall to the floor. "Thank you," he said. "And your friend's going to be all right, and he'll help too," Stan added for good measure. "And look, before we head out, sorry about Judy." Moss looked to the floor and half-heartedly offered, "It's okay." "It isn't, and Judy knows it isn't. What you have to understand is that it's been a tough road." "Oh," Moss said, "because of the—" and he waved his hands vaguely around his genitals. Stan shook his head with a deep pity before taking a breath and looking at Moss seriously. "Nah, mostly because of some other shit. Shit back on the Big Island, but sure, sometimes all the talk of a post-gender world is just that. Talk. Judy has never once been handed anything or been treated fair. Technology the way it is, we can all be more than human. We are born more than human, concocted and altered in a lab, born with nanotech, implants, and altered. You can buy yourself into whatever you want to be. But if your heart knows you weren't born the way you need, some assholes have a problem. It's not only gender, though," Moss pointed out. "I'm sure you know better than anyone that some people have a problem with the tech, too." Stan nodded. "Got that right. I may not want to alter my body, but I don't judge those that do. Those pristiners like my parents railing against science, it's all just fear," he concluded. Moss nodded his understanding. "As someone who doesn't do it, you must have some reservations about the human modifications, though?" Moss asked, and a corner of Stan's lip curled up. "My relationship with it is complicated, sure, but I can separate my feelings about what I want for myself from those which others want for themselves. Not that it doesn't go the other way, too. Many who meet me think I must have a problem with them simply because I don't want the tech for myself. It's a vicious cycle, man." Listening to Stan, Moss knew that he had so much to learn about the world. His world, where neural implants were a prerequisite for employment, was so different from what Stan and Judy saw outside the burbs. There were deep shades of gray in everything, and complicated nuance that Moss would have to examine. "But with Judy," Stan continued, and though he was simply justifying their behavior, Moss could hear the undying love in the man's voice. "Sometimes that anger at an unfair world comes out in ways it shouldn't. Doesn't make it right, but hopefully it helps you to understand." "It does," Moss said, still feeling sorrier for himself than caring about anyone else. "Let's get you some new toys and talk to this girl that's got you all out of sorts." Stan smirked as he turned to lead Moss from the room. Moss felt the blood rush to his face despite himself. "It's just—" he began, but decided to let the issue drop. They exited the tenement building onto a bustling street, mobbed with people on the sidewalks, cars in the street and overhead. The rain was replaced by a thick gray fog hanging in the sky, dulling the colors to a pale hue. Stan had thrown a purple hoodie with the words Miners FC emblazoned on the back over his mesh shirt with a cap to match. "This way," Stan said as he began pushing through the people who Moss now realized were all moving toward a train station at the end of the block, an imposing, artistic spiraled glass building with a towering adjoining parking structure. Train times and directions were displayed on screens facing out toward the street, the helpful information intermittently replaced with commercials for new model cars, drudge personal assistance, and quick travel to other cities. Moss watched, expecting frustration from travelers when the information they required yielded to commercials, but he saw only conceit. The people moved wordlessly past them, staring at their palms or lens screens, lost in earpieces or direct neural messaging. Moss followed beyond banks of storefronts for several blocks before they stopped in front of an antique bookshop with paper books in the window. Fire danced from a gas metal base, above the door with the words Fahrenheit 415 written in scorched, bent rebar before the flames. 415 is the old-time area code for this district. Clever, eh? Stan asked. Yeah, Moss agreed as the guilt returned, knowing that Gibbs would have loved it. A bell chimed as they stepped through the door, and an ancient woman looked up from the book she read with latex-gloved hands. They were surrounded on all sides by bookcases, and the walls were lined with tattered pages.
"Stanley," the woman greeted.
"Chew," he said back, and she smiled, wrinkling her round face.
"I presume you are not here for literary pursuits?"
she asked as she shuffled from her chair with the aid of an ornate wooden cane carved to look like a Chinese dragon, the open mouth flattening into a surface for the palm of her hand. She wore a simple brown cloak which hung down to wooden shoes strapped across her feet. Stan smirked. "Can't say that we are."
"To the back, then,"
Chu said as she moved slowly to a pristine copy of The Price of a Life in a glass case. Moss recognized the book, as it was the first in the series which inspired the founder of Thudoco to name his company for the fantasy empire in which the story took place. Chu produced a remote and key from the folds of the cloak and pressed a large button, shuttering the windows to the outside world before she opened the case with the small key. The room, now lit by nothing more than a small gas lamp on the desk at which she had been sitting, she fumbled behind the book before pressing another button. A click could be heard from the wall behind, and Chu moved over to push hard on a bookcase, which slid a few meters backward. "Any rooms in this city not have hidden compartments?" Moss joked.
"Not in the circles we run in," Stan smiled.
"Ready?" "Yes," Moss said, and followed him around the bookshelf to a room padded with noise insulation foam and broad counters on either side. A young man looked up from the pornography he was watching on an old screen and waved a hand of greeting to Stan. The man had short horns protruding from his head. It was like nothing Moss had ever seen, the slight bone points sticking through the skin. He knew the vanity bioaugments were common, but he had never seen them before in real life. Thudoco had strict policies, and any augmentations had to increase productivity or were not allowed. Moss also understood these types of things to be very expensive, and if this kid had them, he had to be wealthy. Chu peeked from around the corner and yelled at him in a language Moss took to be a Chinese dialect. The horned kid yelled back and waved her away as the bookshelf slid back into place, securing them in the tight corridor room. Moss couldn't help but watch as ejaculate exploded onto a woman's face on the screen, and the young man turned fully around to face them, one hand concealed under the counter. He narrowed his eyes at Stan.
"You always come at the worst time."
"If this is how you work, I doubt there is ever a good time," Stan shot back.
"Got a problem with how I work, maybe you buy guns somewhere else,"
he said in a tone which Moss could not discern. Stan held his hands up conciliatorily as a new scene began on the screen.
"You got the best shit, jack off whenever you want,"
Stan said in a similarly uncomfortable way.
"We just want to get the kid here some gear."
"What do you have in mind?" the young man asked as he stood to reveal he wore nothing more than a long, stained shirt hanging down to mid-thigh, with a noticeable protrusion at the front. There was another protrusion in the back. The kid had a long, slender tail of flesh which swayed and flicked as he walked. Moss grimaced, and for a brief moment just wanted to be back in his hex talking to Moss too.
"Something easy," Stan said.
"Bullets, laser, icer, plasma, sonic, needle, line, beam, eddy, phaser, saucer." Stan rolled his eyes and laughed. "Those last two were made up." The kid laughed and put his hands in the air, raising the hemline of the shirt. "Got me. Serious, what do you want?" "Kingfisher dual beam flip," Stan said, and the man peered under the long metal counter before reaching under and producing the pistol, setting it heavily on the counter with a clang which died in the walls. Gray metal and plastic with the trademark long-billed bird logo along its face. Battery magazine loaded into the base of the grip. A slender metal switch lay atop the pistol's trigger. "You point, you squeeze," the man said to Moss as he handed a box of batteries to Stan. "Flip down, you dosed."
"We can try in the back?"
Stan asked.
"Sure, you want pig?"
Stan shook the question off. "No need to waste a clone, dummy's fine." The young man stepped from the counter, his shirt bunched in his crack as he opened another door at the rear of the room. He waved them in and closed the door behind them. Moss and Stan stood in the tight space, and Stan handed over the weapon. It was much heavier than what they had taken from the burbs. The room was similarly insulated, with a wood table at the front facing a figure which was once made to look like a person, but which was shredded down to the pole set into the cement floor. "Point and squeeze," Stan repeated, and Moss lifted the weapon, remembering the biker's convulsions the last time he had pointed a gun. He inadvertently closed his eyes as he pulled back on the trigger. He smelled the white smoke which spat from the barrel just as an explosion of electricity blasted the blackened wall behind the dummy. The minimal recoil startled Moss, and Stan let out a light chuckle. "All right, you have a few things to learn." He helped Moss with posture, showed him how to hold his arms, square his shoulders, and most importantly, to keep those eyes open. They spent the better part of an hour practicing before Stan finally had Moss flip the switch. Doing this will mean more kick for you, but more stopping power too. It'll make short work of a drudge and even shorter work of a person. You follow? Yeah, Moss said, but I don't want to make short work of a person. I know you don't, but you may have to, Stan soothed. Moss set the weapon down with a heavy thud and sighed. These Carcer Corp people, they're just people too. They took a job and probably have families and kids and stuff, and I'm sure I can't kill them just for taking an evil job. That's a fair point, but you'll feel different when they got a barrel pointed at you, Stan said, his voice hard and unyielding. Maybe, Moss considered. Trust me, they have no qualms about sending you to an early grave. You should try to leave that delicate heart here now. Shouldn't we be better than them? Moss argued, his internal debate finding its voice. We are, Stan said, his clear eyes leaving no doubt as to his belief. Now point and squeeze. Chapter 10. After buying the weapon, holsters, and Dermatos nanomesh bodysuits to disrupt drones and cameras, Moss and Stan made their way from the bookstore. They headed toward a large stone building which had served as a place of prayer for some long-forgotten religious sect in the past, and was now dedicated to computers and digital escapism. They ascended the steps through tall wooden doors with huge metal knockers set into the center. Oval-shaped stained-glass windows showed multicolored images of people interacting with different types of computers. Each pane displayed prices for hourly rent and cast odd light into the room. Banks of computers sat on either side of a long red carpet, leading to a drudge behind a podium. They passed cerebral sync and VR sets on one side, and traditional computers on the other, the clientele appearing to Moss as the types who would prefer a no-questions-asked establishment. "Greetings and salutations, sirs," the drudge loudly greeted as they approached. Cameras set into the head where eyes would be, and a hinged metal plate for a mouth which moved in imperfect synchronization as it spoke. "Private traceless traditional," Stan said, not making small talk with the machine. "Please scan your palm for prepayment," the drudge replied. Stan produced a small screen from his pocket and held it up for the robot to communicate with. "Thank you." "Booth 3, the drudge said, and they made their way to a grouping of small stalls near the entrance doors. They stepped into the box labeled 3 and slid closed a red velvet curtain. Moss could feel Stan's hot, tea-scented breath on his neck as he slid a keyboard toward himself and looked at the screen, watching sheets of information pass before he was met by a blank screen. "This will be secure. You can log into your Thudico account," Stan instructed. "Right," Moss said as he typed his login. His mail was mostly empty, a productivity report from the previous day, a forwarded ad for upgrading C-Dome, and a message from Izzy. He opened it, uncomfortable with Stan reading over his shoulder. "Didn't see you or Gibbs at the gym this morning. Just wanted to make sure you're okay. Call me when you can, I have the day off," was all it read. He was curious if she had stopped by the Hex, too, and found him not at home. "You can call her," Stan said. "She won't be able to see you, though." Moss did so, replying to her message with a call. She answered before the first ringtone. "Hey, Moss," she said excitedly, looking into the camera and furrowing her brows when she didn't see him. "Hey, Iz," he said in as normal a voice as he could muster, but even to his own ears he sounded off. She looked into the camera with a knowing smile. "So you left the burb?" "What? Yeah," Moss answered. "Friends of your parents finally found you?" she asked. And though her big eyes brought Moss more comfort than anyone, the question threw him for a loop. Stan tapped him on the shoulder and shook his head. "What do you mean?" Moss asked, and Izzy rolled her eyes playfully. She picked up the small camera mounted on her desk and showed him the room. "I'm alone. The line isn't tapped. I've been waiting for this for a long time, Moss," she said. And Moss didn't need Stan's guidance this time. "What?" Moss said. "I'm sorry," she replied, and he could hear the truth in her voice. "I've known for a long time. Our parents were friends. It's why it was so important for us to help you all those years. But my dad told me the truth. He told me that one day you would probably run off," she explained, her eyes downcast. Moss couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was another surprise in a long list of surprises. Izzy was the one person he trusted most in the world, and it turned out that she too had kept things from him. "Why?" he murmured. "Dad told me so I wouldn't get—" She trailed off. "No. Why didn't he tell me? Vihan is like a father to me," Moss said, his voice rising. He felt as though he was the only person who didn't know what had been going on. His parents had a network of people working with them, and friends who they trusted but not him. Moss had been alone in the dark. If you had known, you might have tried to do something. Her justification sounded like a plea for Moss to understand. I might have, Moss admitted, and she smiled a sad, grateful smile. Are you ever going to come back? Izzy asked, leaning in toward the camera and looking hopeful. Looking into her big, beautiful eyes in that moment, his anger and confusion drained away. Yes, he answered, a steely determination entering his voice. Izzy, I need your help. Sure, she said before catching her excitement. What can I do? Ask if she can meet you in the Forum at 2200, Stan whispered right into Moss's ear. He instinctively shied away from the closeness. He repeated the instructions to Izzy. Yes, of course, she said. Be in uniform, Moss added, without needing to be told. Oh, Izzy said, the sound of surprise in her voice for the first time. She recovered quickly. Sure, whatever you need. You know you can trust me. She looked miserably at the screen and added, I really hope you know you can trust me. And Moss nodded, knowing she could not see it. See you tonight, he said. And thanks, Iz. See you tonight, she parroted. And though they had only been parted a day, he missed her. Transmission complete. Can you? Stan said. Pardon? Trust her, he clarified. Without hesitation, Moss said, Yes. You sure? Even though she knows what's up? He asked. You trust Judy? Moss asked. It came off a little harsher than he intended, but the doubt of one of his closest friends irked him. Fair enough, he said. You just seemed a little rattled by some of what she said, so I wanted to be sure. Either way, I'll have your back tonight just in case. Good, Moss said, and meant it. Even though he trusted Izzy more than just about anyone, the idea of trust was a confusing mess in his mind at the moment. In a way he didn't fully understand, he trusted Stan more than most of the people he had known his whole life. Stan got a big grin on his face. Hungry? Sure, Moss said, not convinced of the answer. He knew he needed to eat, but the desire was not there. Great, I know a place near here. And guess what? Stan asked with a smile, which implied he was setting up a joke. What? Moss indulged. No hidden compartments. He laughed mildly. Moss smiled. Good. If I have to pass through 2 doors, I'm just going to kick your ass. He joked with a mock punch of Stan's solid bicep. Oh, I'll bet you would. Stan hooted back as they left the stall. Moss took one more look around the building as they left. This hallowed structure, once a place of worship, now devoted to technology. They exited, and Stan led him to a restaurant whose windows had been rented out to a department store nearby. Screens flashed videos of people pretending to laugh and cavort, while in pristine versions of the fashion of the day. Cursed Earth Pizza was written in spray paint above the door. The smell of warming bread and melting cheese filled Moss's nose as they entered, and his stomach let him know that he was hungrier than he had thought, grumbling audibly. That's right, Stan said, pointing to Moss's gut. All natural ingredients. Almost impossible to get these days. City farmed, why it's so expensive. I see, Moss said, never having given any thought to where his food came from. The place was empty. Cherry red-topped bar stools sat before counters which lined the walls of the room. Light forms on screens in the windows shifted and morphed on the checkered floor. Stanley! The lanky man behind the counter shouted with a wave. You brought a new friend. Where's Ina and that sweet ass of hers? Stan chortled. Tell her that and she'll put you through the fucking wall. Don't I know it, he said, and the two slapped palms jovially. Though Moss noticed Stan slide his hand into his pocket to hide something passed in the exchange. You want 2 sunrise slices? Yes, sir, Stan answered quickly, and the man at the counter pressed some buttons on his palm. Catch the game last night? Nah, caught it in reruns, but I was up all night with this sweet slice, he said, eyes growing wide with the excitement of telling his story. He let out a long dog whistle and continued. You ever been with a woman with a tickler installed down there? Hoo, boy, it's a whole new world. I'll bet, Stan said, with unconvincing affected excitement. All right, go sit with your friend, the man behind the counter said, waving Stan off. The two sat side by side in silence for a moment. Moss looked at Stan and winked theatrically. I think shady handoffs count as a back room. Saw that, did you? Stan smirked. Our group sometimes needs some relief, and the pizza isn't the only all-natural thing they sell here. Get me? I do, but I'm guessing you don't take the stuff? You got that right, Stan said. But I'm happy to pick it up, if it helps. Moss smiled. That's nice. I know I am, Stan announced, twisting Moss's words. As I said, we all have a role. It's not just for when we go on runs, but in the downtime, too. I spend more time out in the city grabbing shit because I'm comfortable here. Rosetta doesn't like people, Grimy annoys them, Judy hates them, and Byrne doesn't play well with others. Moss snorted a laugh, thinking of the kid at the noodle shop. So I've seen. And you said there were more groups, like you? Like us? Yeah, Stan nodded, his eyes drifting up to a screen in the corner showing sport highlights. Small pockets of groups with the same goal, trying to free people from the shackles of the big companies who own their lives. His eyes flicked down and he pointed to a passerby. All these folks go about their days indebted, bought and paid for. We seek to free them, whether they know they need it or not. People like me, Moss pointed out. He thought about all the people he had ever known, all the other citizens of the burbs, who had never and would never leave. It had been him only a short while earlier, content to live out his life in his tiny fishbowl. Now that he had stepped foot outside, he wanted to see more. Exactly, though you are a bit of a special case, Stan noted. Right, Moss replied bashfully. But you never meet these other groups? He asked, wanting to learn as much as he could while Stan was being so forthright. Met a few, but we keep separated, so companies like Carcer can't take down the whole if they take down a part. As he explained, he lifted an outstretched hand and bent down one finger and wiggled the others. A couple of times we have worked with another squad on a raid or something, but that's about it. I heard all the crews came together once for some massive job, but it's probably not true. Can't even imagine the type of thing that would bring all us weirdos together. Would be really neat to see, though. Moss nodded, beginning to understand. Stan continued. Folks like SETI help us all to pull in the same direction. Unite the different crews. She gives you orders? Moss asked. Stan chuckled and shook his head. Nah, it's not like that. She gives suggestions, options, lets us know when there are moves to be made. Ultimately, we do our own thing. Anyone do too much of their own thing? Moss asked. Ah, yeah. Some groups have tried to take on too much, got cocky, thought they were all-stars. They learn quick, though. A grave expression darkened his face as he spoke. Carcer comes with a couple of wardens, blast in with DOA bounties. He trailed off, the light of the ads shifting on his eyes as he stared into nothing. Moss understood. You used to run with another crew? It's... he began, before 2 slices of pizza were set before them, interrupting his thought. Lightly sauced on thin dough with cheese oozing down the sides, caused the paper plates to become translucent. Moss's jaw tingled at the smell of it. He blew the steam off just the way he did at home. But he could hardly contain his excitement over the food. Gotta let it cool, Stan warned. I know, he whined, staring at the piece with near ravenous desire. After a moment, Stan peeled his piece from the plate and took a bite with exaggerated enjoyment. Moss followed his lead, and though it burned his mouth a little, it was the best piece of food he had put in his mouth. Oh, man, he murmured through a full mouth. I could get used to this. You're gonna have to, Stan reminded him. How do you learn to cook like this? Moss asked. Pizza University, Stan stated in an obvious joke. I mean, there are culinary schools and stuff, but this place has been here for generations. Parents hand this down to children, and so on and so on. It's a family legacy. Moss considered his words as he delightedly took another bite. Moss, can I ask you something? Sure, he said absently, so focused on the pizza that he was paying attention to little else. You and your friend, the one from the couch, you guys think you can handle this life? I mean, you didn't ask for any of it, didn't choose to do it. It's being thrust upon you. Moss paused a moment, trying to put the confusing jumble of thoughts into words. I don't know, Stan. It's all happened so fast. What I've seen, what I've learned, it's so much. I want to make my parents proud, and some part of me feels connected to what you were doing, in a way I cannot quite parse. I mean, 1 day ago I was sitting in my hex, and 2 days ago I thought that was going to be my whole life. To give it all up, to quit and never look back? I don't know. And Gibbs, he offered to come and I knew I would need him, but to see him shot? Drag him through a city I don't know to help people we've never met? It's hard. He hung his head with a thought. I know the guilt, Stan said softly. You have to turn it into fuel. Let it motivate you. I don't want to live a life guided by revenge, Moss said, more honestly than he expected. It's not revenge, Stan began. Moss held up a hand. Don't tell me it's justice. I won't, Stan said, falling silent. Moss grinned, happy he had been right. But you were going to? Maybe, Stan smiled, raising an implicit eyebrow. Moss smiled, too. He liked Stan. It feels different with you guys, he waxed. Different from the people in the burbs, I mean. Yeah, Stan agreed. That's because even though you lived with them, they were ultimately your co-workers. Oh, Moss said, before admitting I had never thought of it like that. Stan looked at Moss sadly, once again like a little kid who was in over his head. Sorry. It's just another truth I was too simple to see, Moss confessed, more to himself than to Stan. I suppose it's true for you, too. Stan snorted. I had never thought of it like that. I suppose it's a little different, Moss added, and Stan nodded. Both their heads cocked as they heard it. Engines roaring up the street. Unmistakable. Moss's heart began to race as he saw Stan's posture tighten. The first motorcycle zoomed by the window ad, and Moss squinted to see the back of the vest. Stan let out a deep sigh as Moss saw a round shield with skull emblem and the words Hoplite MC written above. Not the Legion, Stan said, as relieved as Moss while the bikes streamed past them. You were good at target practice, but I'm not sure we could take on a gang, just the two of us. Probably not, Moss agreed, seeing a fire in Stan's eyes which had never been there before. He understood then that the ferocity lay just below the calm exterior of the massive man. Nervously, he asked, How many are there? Bike gangs? A lot. Stan snarled derisively. Gangs in general, really. These assholes are just the loudest. You have to understand, out here there are a lot of things people want but can't get. The gangs can provide. People need justice but can't afford a Carcer Corp bounty. Gangs can provide. A lot of people need protection. Stan spread his hands flat. Gangs can provide, Moss filled in. Stan sighed, a low, tired exhalation. In the burbs, they give you everything you think you need, so you never ask for much. Out here, there's a glut of nonsense people think they want, and someone is always out to take advantage. The big companies take most of what people have, and the street thugs take what's left. Chapter 11. Moss sat on a cot, listening to the group bicker about schematics and schemes when he heard a low murmur from the couch. He sprang over to Gibbs's side, his friend's bloodshot eyes blinking to focus. Hey, man, Moss whispered. Hey, Moss, Gibbs said, his voice low and wobbly. Where are we? His eyes scanned the room, eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Byrne took us to a safe house, Moss said, feeling slight guilt that at the moment he felt cool using the term safe house. Byrne? Gibbs said, before clarity flashed in his eyes. Right, we left the burb. We take down Thudikow yet? Become enemies of the state? A weak smile broke out on his dry lips. Not quite yet, but it's moving that direction. Moss smiled. How you feeling? Gibbs smiled weakly. 'Tis but a scratch. You got shot, Moss told him, and his friend rolled his eyes dramatically. I know. It actually doesn't hurt, Gibbs informed him. That's great. Grimy here got you patched. Moss gestured over his shoulder and watched as Gibbs appraised the man. Name's ironic, huh? Clever, he said sarcastically, bringing smiles to the mouths of all except Grimy. Oh, another one of those, the doctor said. Can I put him back under? Kid got shot, so's we could have that chip, Burns said, and Grimy shook his head. So what's next? Gibbs said. Save the damsel in distress? Ooh, I like him. Bit of a firecracker, Stan announced with a smile, and Judy punched him on the shoulder. And he played at an injury. She's no fucking damsel, Judy announced, but without the previous harshness. Stan turned and kissed Judy on the forehead. Don't I know it? Pain in my ass, they retorted, and the two began to kiss, moving quickly to a passion which carried them to a cot. Get a room, Grimy said, holding his hand to his chest in offense. Judy said through pressed wet lips, This is a room. Into the stairwell, then. Byrne ordered the couple, whose clothes were already beginning to come off. They shuffled awkwardly through the door, no longer focused on anything around them, and Stan kicked it closed behind them.
You two ready to hear a plan?
Gibbs leaned forward laboriously, and Moss said, "Yes."
Bring up the display,
Byrne said, and the image of the building appeared in the room once more.
Moss, you and Stan will go meet your friend and hope she can get you in without incident. We're putting a lot of faith in her, and if she wants out when all is said and done, we'll take her. If things go sideways, Stan has orders I hope you'll understand.
He paused, waiting on Moss. Moss nodded and said in the same tone he always used with Mr. Green, "I understand."
Good. Things do turn. Rosetta, Judy, and I will be standing by with drone packs to drop in and lend a hand,
Byrne explained. "Don't let things turn, new guy," Rosetta warned from the desk without turning to look at them. "I don't really dig firefights." Moss's stomach turned. He had never been responsible for more than keeping a drudge from getting dented, and now lives would be depending on him? He nodded nervously.
Seti will be keeping an eye out, but she's got lots of irons in the fire, so bullet hole here. Byrne pointed to Gibbs. You'll be watching the live feed and can call him as you see him.
I veto that nickname, Gibbs said weakly, but I'm happy to help.
Good.
Byrne nodded and lit a cigarette, instantly mixing the smell of smoke into that of stale body odor.
Grammy will be with you, just in case, but he'll duck out if things get hairy.
Don't let things get hairy, Rosetta half-joked, clearly amused by her own repetition.
Byrne snorted. That's enough.
Sorry, Rosetta said. I'm getting close here.
Tell me,
Byrne ordered. Rosetta clicked away for a moment longer and turned. I got it decrypted, she said, turning tired eyes to Moss. It's clear your dad did not want this to be figured out by laymen. But I found myself at a password-protected portion. Gibbs piped up. Did you try? And here he put on a low British accent. Melon! Rosetta chuckled. Cute.
That's enough from the peanut gallery,
Byrne said harshly, and Gibbs sank back into the couch. It just says good night, Rosetta said. Moss smiled. His father had left a riddle which only he could solve. For the first time, Moss felt that he had value in the group. It would be him who helped crack this code. It would be him who connected them with Izzy so they could free their friend. He now meant more in the world than he ever had. Try Mossy, he said with pride. His father had always called him that. Even as he aged and begged him not to, he always did. I did already, Rosetta said plainly, clearly trying not to sound patronizing. The computer is also trying millions of word combinations every nanosecond. Oh, Moss said. He supposed it shouldn't have been that easy, but he had wanted desperately to get it right on his first try. He thought about his father, tucking him in, kissing him goodnight. More often as Moss got older, his father would open the door to his small part of the hex, standing and looking at his son. Moss would sometimes wake up but wouldn't say anything. He would simply crack an eye, see his dad, and fall back to sleep. Moss could hear the thinly veiled disappointment in his friend's voice as Gibbs said, You'll figure it out.
You've got time, Byrne added. Just not all that much time.
Moss plopped down onto one of the couches and thought it over. After a while, Stan and Judy returned, sweaty and stinking of sex. They joined in, trying to workshop the riddle with Moss as the sun began to set. Time passed, with Rosetta clicking away at the ancient keyboard and seeing access denied again and again.
We have to get started,
Byrne announced after many fruitless hours, and the tone in the room shifted. They produced weapons from tattered steamer trunks, and everyone began getting ready in silence. An undeniable tension seeped into every corner of the small space as they prepared. And before too long, Stan turned to Moss. Ready? He asked, seeming to know the answer before he heard it. Yes, Moss answered unconvincingly.
You'll be fine,
Byrne assured him before whispering something to Stan. Don't get killed, Judy said to Stan before turning to Moss. Don't you get him killed. The full weight of the moment landed on Moss's already terrified and heavy heart. He walked over and knelt by Gibbs. You going to be okay here? Moss asked.
Yeah, it'll be just like when we played Ancient Command in Virtual, you know? I'll be calling out orders from on high, and you and Izzy will be on the ground getting things done.
Gibbs and Moss smiled at the childhood memory. They had spent so many afternoons playing that game. At 12 years old, they were one of the best teams in the burb. It was the first video game they had played together, and it had bonded them forever. Moss thought back to when, after several rounds of the game, their small band of hardened digital soldiers trounced an army 5 times their size. The defeated 16-year-olds spent the next week trying to figure out who had defeated them. Moss, Gibbs, and Izzy hiding from the wrath of the older children. "It's just like that," Moss smiled. He began to whisper, "Izzy knew everything. She knew about all of this." "She always knew everything, Moss," Gibbs said with a knowing smirk, and Moss was disappointed that Gibbs was not surprised. "We can trust her, right?" Moss asked, stealing a glance over his shoulder to Judy. "If there is anyone in this world you can trust, it's Izzy," Gibbs said without hesitation. "Why didn't she tell me?" Moss asked. A mixture of heartbreak and anger welled up in him as he thought about it. "Same reason you didn't want me to come." "A misguided attempt at protection," Gibbs said. "I wasn't wrong. You did get shot," Moss argued kindly. "So you keep saying," Gibbs smirked. "If it weren't for the blood loss, I'd already be back on my feet. And anyway, chicks dig scars." Moss grabbed his friend's hand, once again grateful that he had offered to come. "I'll see you soon," Moss said. "I'll see you on the other side of the war," Gibbs sing-songed. Moss couldn't help but chuckle, shaking his head. "I wish I could do that." "What?" "Stay so calm in spite of everything," he explained. Gibbs smiled. "It's a gift. I just feel like I have so much to learn. I didn't prepare for this at all. I don't know how I could have. I mean, I probably just wasn't ready, but now I feel like I'm going to be playing catch-up forever," Moss said. "You'll get there," his friend assured him. "They will help you." Moss looked around the room. He knew there was so much he could glean from all of them, so much they could impart to him. He nodded and stood. "Thanks, Gibbs," he said. "Let's do this." Sitting with Stan in the cab, slowly flying back toward the burbs, Moss watched the rain streak the windows once more. The seat shifted underneath him as he bounced his knee nervously. "It feels like a million years," he said, turning to look at Stan, who was also staring out his window. "Since you left?" Stan asked, his breath fogging the window with each word. Moss nodded, shifting slightly and feeling the spring in the cushion of the ancient cab groan. "Yes, I'm sure it does," Stan said. "Make you wish we had never come into your life?" Moss was surprised that he didn't have to think about the question. "No," he said. "I'm happy you did. I've been confused and terrified since the moment Ina knocked on my door. I've come to realize much of what I thought my life had been was a lie, and come to know that my family were not the people I thought I knew. But despite everything, I'm actually happy. In some way, this feels more like the life I was supposed to live." "It is," Stan said. He seemed more absent than Moss was used to. In a short time, he had become accustomed to Stan's gregarious energy, but now he seemed distracted. "Everything all right?" Moss asked, causing Stan to blink hard and turn. It was an obvious lie when he murmured, "Yes." "I mean, I know we only just met, but," he began, but Stan cut him off. "It's not that," he said. "It's my pre-game ritual. Right before a mission, I think about everything that could go wrong, but also everything that can go right. Try to think about every eventuality, possibility. Coaches always try to instill that in us. But your grandma helped to teach me to look at the whole board, you know?" "Yeah," Moss replied. "You miss it? Sports, I mean?" Stan worried at some crust on his pant leg. "Not really. I was never in it for the fame or nothing. I love the sport and being part of a team. And though the sport has changed, I'm on a pretty great team now." Moss cocked an eyebrow. "No part of you is in it for the fame?" Stan chuckled. "I'm not saying I hated it." He winked, sounding more like himself. "First time's the hardest." Moss let out a grim chuckle. "Nice thing is, if I botch it, I'll be dead and won't care so much." "Could be captured," Stan noted. Moss's hands went numb. The thought of being killed scared him, but the idea of being captured, tortured, and questioned about something he did not fully understand terrified him much more. He had tried to rationalize all of this, make it seem like some abstract or not real event. But as the burbs grew closer outside the window, the reality of what he was doing was undeniable. Fear began to grip him as he felt his heart rate and breathing quicken. A massive hand landed on his shoulder. "You'll be fine," Stan said, and as Moss looked up, something in Stan's eyes made him feel like the words were true. Moss breathed in deeply just before the first-generation cab they had hired shuddered and began to drop to the landing pad. It hissed to the ground, vibrating and jerking as it landed. The door clanged open and they stepped out. As he put his foot to the ground, Moss realized that he hadn't been made sick by the descent. He smiled. "I will be fine," he told Stan. The landing pads were on a raised platform off the side of the Forum, a place which served as a meeting spot between the burbs where friends could eat and shop and feel as though they had left home without the discomfort of actually doing so. A large plaza of decorative marble with a fountain and hollow-projected trees was flanked on all sides by restaurants, cafes, boutique shops, and travel agencies. Relief aids stood like statues outside the bars, ready for rental by inebriated employees. Stan's eyes scanned around the space. He turned to Moss. "Know where we meet your friend?" "Yeah," Moss said, pointing to Nonsense Restaurant. Izzy had invited Moss to join her family there for dinner on occasion, and though he had never taken her up on the offer, he figured she would be there. They made their way to the restaurant as the smells of spices and curry filled their nostrils. The scent instantly brought back memories of eating dinners Vihan cooked for them in his hex. "We may leave here now, but it's important to remember where you come from. These are the tastes of your home, though you may never go there," he had told his daughter before setting the plates in front of them. And though Moss had infrequently joined them for dinner, the smell in the Forum made him feel that he was home. Izzy waved them from the window, a half-eaten plate of biryani set before her. Confusion coursed through him as he looked at her. Her jet-black hair pulled into a bun, beautiful brown skin showing from under her armor, and bright chestnut eyes smiling at him. His heart began to race once more, though this time not for fear of what lay ahead. Stan smiled and half-mocked. "I get it now." "You saw her before," Moss reminded him. "It's different in person," Stan told him. He was right. Though it had only been 2 days, seeing her again now stirred something within him. She stood as they entered and sprang into his arms, her armor clattering. She stepped back and looked him in the eyes. "Are you all right?" she asked, as though they had been parted for years. "I am," Moss said. "You?" "I'm fine. How did you take the news? How did you find out?" "I'm sorry I didn't tell you." She looked so apologetic Moss could hardly stand it. "I found out from the person we are here to help," Moss explained, "and I'm fine. It's okay that you didn't tell me. I know you were doing what you thought was best." "How much do you know about them?" Stan cleared his throat theatrically and the two turned. Izzy nodded in understanding and turned to the middle-aged man with thinning hair behind the counter. "Kunil, turn the music up and stir a pot in the back." He hurriedly followed the command and disappeared into the kitchen. The room became filled with synthesized sitar and a woman singing slowly. Moss had never heard Izzy act as a Burbsec officer before and was impressed by the effect. She appraised Stan and asked Moss, "Who's your friend?" "Stan," Moss introduced as the large man intentionally loomed over her. "Izzy," she said, extending a hand and smiling in a way that indicated that she was unimpressed by his attempt to intimidate her. "Ferocious Stan," he corrected in a tone more threatening than friendly. Izzy wrinkled her nose at Moss almost imperceptibly as they shook. "We can talk here?" Stan clarified, looking suspiciously around the room. "Yes," Izzy answered. "Family friend and I'm off duty." "Good," Stan said. "What do you boys need from me?" she asked, forgoing small talk. Stan opened his mouth to speak, but Moss beat him to it. Before we begin, you need to understand something," he said, and both stared at him in shock. "Yeah?" Izzy said. He cleared his throat to buy time and averted his eyes. "This is a big ask. You help us now, you may be giving up your whole life." "Oh," she said sullenly, looking down and shifting one foot as she thought. "She helps us, Byrne says we can take her on," Stan announced to Moss. Then he turned to Izzy. "Sorry," he corrected. "Hate it when people talk about me like I'm not in the room. You help, you can come with us." "Thank you," she said, not looking up. Moss could hear the internal struggle in 2 short words, and worried as to what she and Stan were thinking at the moment. Leaving had been hard for him, though he left little behind except for comfort. It would be much different for Izzy. She had a life that she had worked for, a job she was good at, and a life she enjoyed. She had her dad and friends. Asking her to risk all that for him made him feel sick. "You can say no," Moss offered, in that moment hoping she would. She turned such sad eyes upon him that he nearly demanded she went back to her hex. "I'll help," she said. "For you." Moss did not know what to make of that. "I left you in the dark for so long," she said by way of justification, though Moss did not know if the words were for him or for herself. "You don't have to," he told her. "You could just walk away." She thought on his words as Stan shifted with impatience under the bright fluorescent lights. "I'll help," she announced once more. "What do you need?" "Can you get us into the Carcer Corp facility where they transfer prisoners from Burbsec?" Moss asked. "Yeah," she answered. "I know there has been activity. It's what everyone is talking about since the lockdown." Stan asked, "You have access to the cells?" "Sure, I have to be able to put people there myself," she explained. "Though of course I never have." "It's all traceable," Stan reminded her unnecessarily. "Once we are inside, we'll deal with the Carcer guards." "When you say, deal with?" Izzy asked, worry covering her face. "I mean deal with," Stan intoned in such a way as to leave no doubt. Izzy nodded her understanding. "Gonna finish that?" Stan asked, pointing to the plate of spiced rice. "What? No," Izzy answered, looking nonplussed. She pushed the plate of food to Stan and handed him the fork, which he took graciously. "Energy, man," Stan justified to Moss as he sat. "Split it?" "No," Moss answered, too struck by the shift to say anything else. Stan sat and worked at the food voraciously. "Safe to say your life has changed," Izzy joked nervously, pulling a piece of sleeve which stuck out from under the wrist of her armor and rubbing it between her thumb and forefinger. "You are not wrong," Moss said, wearing a weak smile. He could not even begin to tell her how much his life had changed. "Where's Gibbs?" she asked. "He came with you, right?" The guilt hung on his every word. "I'll tell you later." Chapter 12. They strode through the forum, a Burbsec officer and two obvious city dwellers turning more than a few heads. Izzy led them to a corridor between two buildings as Stan snickered. "What?" Moss asked. Stan smirked. "You catch the name of that bar?" "Lewd and Lascivious," Moss answered with a shrug. He had never been, but knew Gibbs would go there with some of his co-workers from time to time. "Yeah," Stan laughed. "A sports bar with girls in hot pants dancing on the tables? You fucking bubs don't even know the meaning of lewd and lascivious." Having seen the long-legged spinners even from the outside, Moss had to agree, and began to speak before Izzy hissed, "Will you two hush up?" They approached a concrete pillbox with the Burbsec seal painted on a thick metal door. "Entry code 610, Moss heard her command in his mind, and the barcode on her name tag was scanned before the door hissed open. "There's a lot of these side entrances, so the average employee doesn't see people being dragged very far," Izzy explained as she led them down concrete steps whose yellow paint had been worn off over time. Light bulbs in metal cages illuminated the corridor, which seemed to stretch on as far as Moss could see. They walked a while before Izzy spoke again. "Ferocious Stan," she began respectfully. "You should take the lead here. There will be a guard stationed as we round the next corner." "Right," he said, and stepped in front of them, cracking his knuckles with dramatic flair. They stepped past a line of demarcation spray painted on the floor, the blue beehive shield logo of Burbsec on the near side, and the handcuffed scorpion pincer emblem of the Carcer Corporation on the other. "Thank you, Iz," Moss said. She turned sorrowful eyes on him as he heard her neural command, "Security Order 19? That was it. He wasn't surprised, only disappointed. "Listen, Moss," she began, but his hand was already reaching for the weapon at his side. It was not instinct as it had been with the biker. It was a calculated move. He knew how much he had asked of her, how much she would have had to give up to help them. He also knew how much it would help her Burbsec career if she stopped them. He had hoped that she wouldn't betray them, but he understood why she had. His heart broke as he pressed his thumbnail against the switch, ensuring it was set to non-lethal. Her eyes went wide with disbelief as he raised the weapon, pointing to the break in her armor at the shoulder. He knew the wiring would distribute the shock. Stan had taught him as much. The lights in the hallway turned red, and she had time to say, "No!" as he pulled the trigger. Stan wheeled back around with his revolver and aimed as an overhead speaker blared, "Security alert!" The world was immediately flooded in red light. Moss found himself saying, "I'm sorry," as the shock hit his oldest friend, who crumpled instantly into his arms. His eyes burned and his face contorted in anger, disappointment, and fear. He lay her down and turned to look at Stan with his weapon pointed at them. Moss snarled, "It's dealt with." Stan lowered his weapon. "I'm sorry." But Stan's words hardly registered. "Me fucking too," Moss exclaimed, his words muffled in his own ears, drowned out by the alarms. "We have to move," Stan ordered. "I know it," he said through gritted teeth, his last conversation with Gibbs replaying in his mind. He looked at Izzy, her shallow breaths causing her armor to rise and fall ever so slightly. He pulled the name tag from her armor and wiped the tears from his face as he stood, accepting that he could trust no one but himself in this world. "Let's do something good," he told Stan, and they hurried down the hallway. A guard turned to meet them at an open door at the end of the hall, and Stan brought the butt of his weapon down so hard on the man his helmet shattered, sending him crashing to the floor. Moss held his weapon forward as they continued down more corridors. "We've been compromised. Meet us at the front for extraction," Moss heard Stan command in his mind. "Already en route," Judy answered. Moss had watched this version of events play out on the hologram, and knew they would make their way to the holding cells before leaving through the front door where the rest of the crew would be waiting. Time was paramount now, as Carcer would be mobilizing men and drudges to converge on this location. 2 more guards awaited them around the next corner. One knelt, opening a box containing an auto-assembling turret. Stan's weapon boomed in the contained space, and the man on the ground was sprayed with the blood of his cohort as Moss pulled his own trigger with fury, the first few shots spraying electric blue all over his armor before finding a gap. He convulsed violently and crunched against the ground before he had a chance to activate the turret. Blood pooled dark crimson onto the hard floor, and Moss stared a moment at the 2 men, one living, one forever dead. Once a month in the burb, handlers made a special show of putting chickens in with 2152's mascot tiger. Employees would gather to watch the beasts stalk the helpless birds before turning them into plumes of feathers and viscera. Next to Stan, moving toward their destination, Moss felt a kinship with the animals. He could not wait for the next guards, his finger poised on his trigger. All sympathy he had felt for them lay 2 hallways back, taking shallow breaths. He nearly pulled the trigger once more as the 2 stepped through another door to the holding cells and figures appeared before them, standing over the bodies of 6 guards. He had to blink hard to catch his brain up to what he was seeing. Ina stood poised with an auto rifle pointed directly at them, a naked man cowering behind her. One windowless cell door was open and faced a bank of computer monitors displaying images from inside the cells and around the facility, where guards were hurrying into position. The feed from the outside of the structure showed no activity except the guards, though Moss knew that was about to change. "What the fuck are you 2 doing here?" she shouted at them over the sounds of the alarm. "Of course," Stan said, getting a read of the moment Moss did not understand. "We're here to rescue you," Moss explained, but Stan was already shaking his head at the words. Ina laughed as she reloaded her rifle. "Aw, my dipshits in shining armor." "This him?" the man asked as he pulled some clothes for himself out of a security guard's locker and began to dress hurriedly, having to try several times before feeding his arm into one of the sleeves. Ina was still dressed the way Moss had seen her when they had met, and what Stan had realized now dawned on him, too. Her garbled message had not said that she was captured, but that she was going on the rescue mission herself. "Chicken thumbs?" Moss asked the Caucasian man, who appeared to be in his late 20s, was slightly overweight, and bore the fresh purpling-yellow bruises of someone who had recently been asked some aggressive questions by Carcer Corp jailers. "The one and only?" Chicken Thumbs said, spreading his arms wide. His body moved with jerky, uneven motions as he reached down to pick up one of the guns from the floor. "Good thing you all got here when you did. I was a few hours away from a one-way trip to Carcer City." "Hey, fuckwits," Ina interrupted. "People are coming to kill us, so perhaps we can save the introductions and platitudes for later?" "Yeah," Stan agreed as gunfire illuminated one of the screens. "Cavalry's here." They stepped over the bodies as they moved back into the passageways. Lighted exit signs guided their way, and they heard yelling from around another corner. Stan and Ina led the way, with the other 2 dogging their steps. Ina peeked around the corner. 3 more, she announced, with a turret. "I'll take the left?" Stan asked, and Ina rolled her eyes and shot him a devilish grin as she pulled the pin from a heat-seeking grenade. She sent it bounding down the hallway, small pins firing out one after another to seek the bodies of the guards. They heard, "Shit!" before a white light and loud explosive bang filled the space. No sooner than it happened did Ina and Stan round the corner, the auto rifle and revolver singing their songs of death in unison. Moss and Chicken Thumbs followed, but were left useless. Where he had felt like a hunter moments before, Moss was instantly relegated to a support role with the two now leading them. Though he didn't want to kill, neither did he want to do nothing. "It's not much further," Ina told them as they stepped through the gore. "There will be a lot more at the front, so you two asshats may have to actually do something." Her words stung, but Moss simply nodded. Chicken Thumbs stepped through the blood and slipped, splaying his legs before he splashed to the ground. "Ew!" he said as he tried to right himself, sliding again and landing face first into more of the warm, sticky red liquid. "You may have to find a new job," Ina said, shaking her head with disgust as he stood, his clothes clinging to his body. Trying to wipe the blood from his eyes simply smeared it more around his pudgy face. The guilt Moss had felt about bringing Izzy, the person who betrayed them to the authorities, was somewhat diminished in the face of CT's seeming ineptitude. As they moved further, Stan sidled up to Moss. "Quit hugging the wall like that," he said, pulling Moss toward the center. "One of those turrets starts firing, lots of bullets will slide along and make short work of your side." "Oh, okay," Moss said weakly, realizing once again how truly far he was from being the tiger. "Thanks," he said, "for everything." "I got you," Stan smiled. "Just remember, you got an important place in all this." Moss would remember that moment for the rest of his days. They all huddled as they neared another corner. "Lucky Futico doesn't like straight lines," Chicken Thumbs observed. "Idiot! They are trying to make blind spots and choke points. There are going to be a lot of bodies around this," Ina said, not masking her derision. "Wish you had saved that grenade," Stan said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Stanley, sometimes it's like you don't know me at all," Ina said with a crooked smile, producing another grenade from beneath her jacket. "Once this hits, we all pop out and lay it down." "Right," Moss said, making circles with his thumb on the side of his weapon. "Let's see if you're worth all this trouble," Ina added, making Moss more resolute. He was going to prove his worth to them, show them that he wasn't just some useless bub. "Isn't there some cover we can use?" Chicken Thumbs pleaded, his words running counter to his grim visage. "Do you see any fucking cover, CT?" Ina asked. "We have to get the fuck out of here." Ina pulled the pin and tossed the grenade. The guard sounded prepared this time, hollering, "Incoming!" The narrow corridor was filled with light and sound once more, and bullets and beams filled the small space as they stepped around the corner. It seemed to happen faster than Moss's mind could compute as he pulled the trigger of his weapon, sending blast after blast into the group of 7 guards. They fired at the group, who crouched behind mobile auto-folding metal walls. Chunks of wall and ceiling exploded and rained down, filling the space with rocks and dust as Stan bobbed and weaved toward the group. Moss watched as the only guard who had not lowered his visor looked in shock as the massive man kicked the shield, sending 2 flying backward. Ina and Moss let loose a barrage as the other guards turned to watch their compatriots. Moss hit one in the helmet, seeing the Regnad display within the visor. Ina's rifle made short work of 2 more, while one man seemed to be merely cowering in terror. A loud crack sent chills down Moss's spine as Stan spun the head of one guard to face backward. The other guard on the ground leveled his weapon at the same time as Stan stood. The guard fired a shot which grazed Stan's shoulder as he moved down the hall. Enraged, Stan pounced and knocked the gun loose before bringing a fist down on the guard's unprotected face. Blood cascaded as he hit the man again and again with a rage Moss had never before witnessed. Moss turned too slowly as the last remaining guard took aim and fired with a trembling hand. Simultaneously, a shot rang out from behind him, killing the guard as Moss's vision went white with pain. He looked down to see his shoe split open, blood and smoke pouring out. Moss collapsed in pain as Ina made sure the guards were no longer a threat. She turned to see Moss clutching his foot. "Shit," she muttered as she made her way to him. "You all right?" "Got shot," Moss told her, though he knew she was aware. He had never known pain, never experienced anything like the firefight he had just witnessed. The VR games he had played, simulating modern war, were nothing like the carnage before him, and the simulated gunshots, nothing like the excruciating feeling emanating from his foot. Ina offered him a hand and pulled him to his feet. She produced a small tube from her pocket and pressed a button with her thumb as she placed it against his neck. The stim injector worked instantly, subsiding the pain and making Moss feel as though he could burst through the front door and take on Carcercorp himself. "Thank you," he said genuinely. "No worries, still more to do." "Can you walk?" she asked, her fierce eyes looking right into his. Yeah, he said, and stamped the foot, which produced a squishing sound but no longer pained him. He looked down to examine the wounded appendage, and realized a good chunk of the side was gone. He knew it was the drugs which caused him not to care, but he wasn't bothered by that fact either.
Clear up top. Rosetta's working on the front door for you all, but we'll have company shortly,
Byrne related. Got 2 squads headed your way, Gibbs informed them. Byrne added,
They'll be on us right quick.
We're clear and headed to you, Ina told them. She reloaded her auto rifle and said aloud, Let's move! As Stan had predicted, Moss felt little remorse as he stepped over the people who would have been happy to kill him and had shot his foot. The metallic scent of blood mixed with acrid smoke, gunpowder, dust, seared flesh, and plastic filled his nose. He watched Stan rise to his feet, his eyes dark, like that of a shark, and his posture twisted predatorily. Splatter gleamed against his pale skin. His mesh ripped where the guard had thrashed against him. I was an engineer, Moss thought aloud. In a past life, Ina replied, the barrel of her rifle still seeping a trail of smoke. She knelt and quickly wrapped his foot in a roll of bandage Moss had not even seen her produce. Got that right, Moss agreed, and one side of Ina's mouth turned upward slightly. To the front, Stan ordered, his light affability replaced with a coldness to match his appearance. Still can't believe you thought I needed rescuing, Ina mocked as the group made their way up the hallway toward the front of the structure. Moss marveled at the size and scope of the tunnels which led to such a small building. Communication was shit, got bad intel, made a call, Stan stated. You must be real fun at parties, Moss joked as though speaking to Gibbs rather than a murderous pseudo-stranger. Stan snarled, like you've ever been to a fucking party. Cut him some slack, first time he's been dope, no doubt, Ina defended. Stan snorted. And people wonder why I don't touch the stuff, he said under his breath, but loud enough to be heard. I like regular Stan more, Moss couldn't help but joke. Stan spun on him and scruffed him by the shirt, lifting him so his toes just touched the ground. Ferocious Stan is all that's keeping you and chicken shit alive, he hissed into Moss's face. I hate that nickname, Chicken Thumb said, cutting the tension. Gibbs used a veto on his, Moss joked as Stan lowered him to the ground, wearing a face of disgust which Moss ignored. Chicken Thumbs raised an eyebrow. Who's Gibbs? Hey, dingbats! Can we get the fuck out of here before Stan does Carcer's job for them? Ina said as she began to walk again. The hallway opened into a large anteroom, with security office on one side, large glass windows looking into the space. A huge metal door, large enough for a truck to be backed into, was set into the concrete. A solitary guard squatted at a panel next to the door, attempting to counter whatever Rosetta was doing on the other side. Stan was on him before he knew what hit him, slamming the man's face so hard into the door that his helmet cracked and visor split. Saved us a bullet. Chicken Thumbs shrugged as Moss watched the body slump. Moss noted how little protection the armor offered. He wondered if it served more to give them an intimidating appearance than to actually protect them. He decided he would wait to ask, the initial rush of the drugs having worn off. Thanks, guys, Rosetta said. I'll get it now. An eerie calm descended as they waited for the door to open, Stan pacing impatiently and Ina checking and reloading her weapon. How'd they get you? Moss asked Chicken Thumbs to fill the silence, his voice reverberating down the hall. The young man chuckled miserably. On my way to meet you, I was stopped by BurbSec. Tried to talk my way out of it the way I've seen her do 100 times, but they didn't buy it, he explained. You were probably shaking like a fucking leaf and sweating like a stuck pig, Ina chided. Yeah, I stick out like a sore, he began, his voice rising with the joke. Don't you fucking say it, bloodbath, Ina interrupted, but Chicken Thumbs smirked anyway. Got it, Rosetta informed them as the massive door thumped and began to slide open, revealing her working at a panel on the outside. Byrne and Judy had their backs to them, pointing weapons to the sky. Moss took a breath of the clean air as it poured into the hallway. It smelled like the rain. No sooner than Moss had taken the one free breath than the dark sky became dotted with approaching Carcer guards, the flashing red lights from their drones announcing their arrival. Moss knew what happened next unfolded in mere seconds, but the stims slowed time as the action began. Byrne sent a line into the air, one guard's legs falling to the earth as his upper half went careening into a building in an explosion which shook the structure. Judy sprayed the sky with what amounted to fireworks, the bursts of cascading sparks causing more guards to recalculate their descent. 2 were able to land, firing shots which scattered Judy and Byrne. Ina and Stan ran out into the open, the auto rifle screaming shots which felled one of the guards. The other paused just long enough to point in the direction of Moss, who lifted his weapon in what felt like slow motion. He heard the pop of the weapon in the distance, and felt the blood spray his face. He gritted his teeth, and he felt his thumb move as Rosetta's head jerked to the wall in a crimson splat. He pulled the trigger and felt the recoil this time as the blue electric streamed toward the man, blasting open his armor. The second shot exploded his chest open in a mixture of smoke and carnage. He knew what he had done. He knew he had ended a life. After all his protestations, Stan had been right. He felt no guilt for the man, only sorrow for Rosetta, the woman he had assured this wouldn't happen. Weapons fired and alarms rang out as he knelt next to her body, red streaks pouring down over the tattoos on her neck. "No!" Ina shouted as she ran back and over to Rosetta. She clutched the body for just a moment, her face angry and inconsolable. She turned and looked at him with eyes that pierced his soul before darting back into the fray, screaming a war cry. As one Carcer officer landed, she grabbed the muzzle of his weapon immediately, pulling him stumbling forward. She spun him to face the oncoming fire from one of his allies, and he was riddled with bullets meant for Ina. She was covered in blood as she returned fire, making innumerable men pay for the death of her friend. Moss could not move. He was immobilized by all of it. Seeing a new friend die, killing someone, it was all too much. 2 days earlier he had been an engineer, a cog in the machine, a nobody. Now he was something else, something he couldn't even identify. He looked down at Rosetta's body, feeling like he might throw up. "I'm so sorry," he whispered to her. Her blank eyes stared into space. Chicken Thumbs pulled him to his feet. As he stood, he saw one more Carcer officer take aim, and Moss felt his arm move lethargically. Exhaustion, terror, and regret was keeping his body from obeying his brain. He simply watched in stunned silence as the man pointed his weapon directly at him, poised to fire death. The officer's head exploded, blood spraying into the lighted night sky. Moss turned slightly to see Judy, weapon smoking in hand, give a slight nod. "Second round closing in," Gibbs informed them as they hurried to Byrne and Judy. "Here," Byrne said as he strapped a drone pack to Moss, metal arms wrapping themselves around his torso, clipping together to form a booster at his chest. "It'll get you out of here." Judy screamed something at him and spit on the ground, but he was too sorrowful to hear or care about the insult. The slight engine on his back whirred to life. "Stakes in the wind," said he ordered, and Moss lifted into the sky. All the members of the group flew in different directions as Moss's stomach lurched. In the solitude of the night sky, he was left with his thoughts. Izzy's face as she realized he was going to shoot her replayed in his mind before becoming Rosetta. The sound of the alarm, the blood, Stan prowling, being shot, the drugs, the sizzle of the guard's chest. It was too much to bear. More had happened in the last hour than in Moss's previous 19 years. The drone shifted and buckled in the wind. A thunderclap. Light misting rain like hundreds of people spitting in his face before opening up, giving way to heavy rain. Every drop slapping him, as if the world knew the enormity of what he had just experienced. The lights from the city grew in the distance as the burbs disappeared. He turned his head as if to hide from it all, and retched into the darkness. Chapter 13. Moss landed in a puddle, people turning to look at him in surprise, their eyes wide and mouths agape. Personal pack drones were expensive and required an even more costly registration and license. They were therefore uncommon, particularly with people as bedraggled as Moss appeared. He slumped to the ground, crawling under an awning in front of a 24-hour palm screen repair shop. The ride had sapped any remaining strength, and he leaned against the glass storefront, wrapping his arms around his knees. A hand appeared in his vision. "Let's go home," he heard Ina say. The word home rang false. He didn't feel as if he had a home anywhere in the world. He listened to the thumping of the rain on the awning. "Moss," Ina said, her voice soft, almost sweet. He looked up, her wet hair glowing, her eyes big and kind. "Shit happens. We all know the risk." She paused a moment, choking down emotions. She knew the risk. The words fell heavy on him, and Ina tried to recover. "You did good, but we have to go. That gauze had clotting gel, but that foot's going to be a problem if we don't get you some proper help." He nodded, happy it was she who found him. Her jacket opened slightly as she helped him to his feet, exposing her bare breast through the mesh bodysuit. The curvature was a welcomed distraction, albeit fleeting. He couldn't tell if she didn't notice or didn't care as his eyes wandered up to her face. In a weak voice, he said, "Okay, we can go." "I know it," she replied, obviously resenting the implication. Not knowing what else to say, he muttered, "Sorry, let's go," she commanded. They walked the lighted streets, both completely soaked through. Moss hated the feeling, the wetness bothering him more than the foot leaving dark streaks in the puddles. They weaved through neon-lit streets and alleys, the darkness and rain doing nothing to deter the denizens of the city from going about their business. "This is all a pretty rude awakening for you?" Ina asked, pulling her hair back with her hands to wring it out and get it out of her eyes. "Yeah," Moss answered, needing to constantly steady himself with a hand on her shoulder. "I just wish I had known." The admission pained him. "Why?" Ina asked, and the question surprised him. I could have prepared," he fumbled, wiping water from his face. "You think anything in the burbs could have prepared you for tonight?" Looking around the unfamiliar streets, cold faces and dangerous streets, he sullenly admitted, "No. Durako doesn't teach classes on fighting the power," she joked with a slight smile. He joined her in the smile and added, "Fighting the Power 101. "Right," she chuckled, and cupped her hands to her mouth, blowing into them for warmth. "You will get used to it, to all of it." "I'm not sure I want to," he told her, feeling at ease with her, as he had with Stan. He understood why his family liked this crew. "I get that," she sympathized, "but important things require sacrifice, in every meaning of that word." "Sure," he agreed, "but I imagine you've had your whole life to ready yourself for that. I've had 3 days. "I didn't have my whole life," Ina began, but trailed off. Moss didn't speak, hoping she would continue to talk. She did. "I was a normal kid. Came for money, really, if you can believe it. Dad kicked me and Mom out when he realized relief aids don't talk back. He had the kind of connections which meant the law would work in his favor. Child support, alimony, all the mandatory minimum. Cut us out of his life with little more than a couple of bucks being transferred from some forgotten account once a month. We made do the best we could. Mom waited tables, and I fell in with the kind of kids who know how to make a quick buck. Those kids made me smart, tough, taught me how to survive. I needed it, too. Mom got killed in a holdup. Drunk asshole wanted to steal a pie. A fucking pie. Cook wanted to play at being a hero, and Mom tried to step in. Some good it did her. "You try to go back to your dad?" Moss asked. "Tried. But he had as much interest in being a father as I did in kowtowing to the prick who had thrown Mom out. So I got the urchins together and we robbed him. Foolish kid idea, I know it now. He had the money to get a bounty on us, and I learned how Carcer does things. When I got out, my former friends wanted nothing to do with me, blamed me for bringing the heat down on them. I was alone, so I got smart. Learned how to hack, steal, learned what trucks the big companies wouldn't miss. I had a fence wrapped around my finger so I could get the best deals. But he got wise when I wouldn't put out and made a threat. I wasn't gonna whore, and when he figured that out, he finked. Got some thugs to try and learn me. I gave as good as I got at first, but it was 4 against 1, and eventually they got the better of me," she said. She paused a moment, seeming lost in thought, and Moss wondered how much of the story was true. She had seemed so tough to him, and he had a hard time picturing anyone being able to take her on. They trudged forward, the constant rain pounding Moss down, making it harder for them to move. She squinted at him. "Grimy found me, broken and bruised as he came out of a haberdashery, as you would expect. But you might not expect that he took pity on me, bringing me to a safe house to get patched." She smiled then, with a glint in her eye. The same glint which Stan had when he was telling Moss about his past. "That's when I met Byrne and Sandra. They honed my skills. Showed me that what I was good at could be put to use. That I could do some good in this grim fucking world. I wanted to help, I craved it. I wanted the men like my father, the people who valued money above all things, to pay for their greed, to see that the people they treated as little more than drudges were real, could have power all their own. This cause, however you see it, that your family helped shape, means everything to me. To all of us.
To Rosetta. She let the name hang, eyes downcast. Moss didn't know how long they had known each other, or what their relationship had been, but he could tell she was taking the loss hard. You ever go back for the fence? Moss asked, not wanting to dwell on the death for which he blamed himself. Ina's head dipped slightly with the shame of it. Yes, she said. I went back for him with my new skills and a few augments. I released a fury on him I didn't realize was in me, but... She fell silent once more. Moss matched the silence as they stood before the apartment complex, not entering. I had never seen Byrne so disappointed. Really? He seems like the type who wouldn't mind, Moss said, and Ina shook her head. No. He said petty revenge was beneath us. He explained that we were part of something bigger, and to risk getting caught over a personal vendetta was just hogwash. I can see that, Moss said as they entered the building. Point being, I may have had more than a few days, but not really my whole life to prepare, she concluded. Moss let out a little chuckle. Fair enough, Moss said, gripping the banister hard to ascend the stairs. When they entered the hidden apartment, Grimy rushed over, seeing the blood seeping from Moss's foot. He gestured for Moss to move to a couch. Join the club? Gibbs mocked in a whisper, glancing toward Stan laying on one of the cots, one massive bloody paw hanging over the edge. Couldn't let you have all the fun, Moss said with a pained smile as he moved through the room, blood and water dripping and pooling on the floor. Gibbs couldn't hide the sorrow on his face. You all right? Yeah, Moss forced, pulling the soaking trench coat from his body with great effort. Liar, Gibbs said, and one corner of his mouth turned up. Moss chuckled. Yeah. If you two could keep the prattling to a minimum, Byrne said from a dark corner, gripping a bottle, his face momentarily illuminated by the flare of a cigarette. Sorry, Gibbs said. Moss had not even noticed him. Don't mind him, Grimy said as he cut away at the wet bandage. He gets morose after a job. After a loss like that. He has every right to be miserable, Moss said quietly. You all do. Grimy didn't look at him, didn't give any reaction, and Moss stared at the cables dangling on the ceiling. Dust covered their tops and spiderwebs undulated slowly. This is pretty bad, he heard Grimy say, though he didn't look down. I can patch it, but it may be better to take him to see the farrier. Moss glanced over as Byrne rose and entered his field of vision. He could barely make out the old man's grizzled face under the brim of his hat. You want an upgrade? What? Moss asked. He pointed a finger at Moss's legs. New foot. Maybe two for good measure. He's more machine now than man, Gibbs said in a tone Moss recognized as an impression. Moss began to answer, but the door to the apartment slammed open. Judy snarled, rocketing toward Moss. You piece of shit! Ina moved between them quickly, holding up a hand. What? She asked, though Judy's angry eyes were fixed on Moss. His fucking girlfriend got Rosetta killed. I told you we couldn't trust them, Judy said, pointing an accusing finger at Byrne. Ina kept shifting and moving to try and hold her friend's wild eyes. What do you mean? Stan said the other bubs set off the alarms, Judy hissed. No, Ina said, the word ringing out like a shot. And Moss's face wrinkled with confusion. What would you know about it? Judy seethed. More than you. I was in the fucking room, Jude, Ina said, her voice raising. A guard pressed the alarm button before I could take them all down. What? Moss asked in horror, guilt coursing through him. Judy stopped to listen as well, taking a deep breath. Stan peered over from his cot. I couldn't get them all down in time, and one set off the alarm when I got to CT. I watched him press the button myself. About the same time, though, the cell doors unlocked. When I saw you guys, I assumed it was you who hacked the doors, Ina explained as Moss's hands went numb. No, Moss uttered. He didn't want to believe it. Couldn't believe it. Visions of Izzy's face as he raised the weapon played in his head. He had betrayed her, not the other way around. He had shot her. To protect her, he tried to rationalize. Stan wouldn't have given her time to explain as soon as the alarm had gone off. He would have killed her. Gibbs moved laboriously over to Moss. So,
What happened?
He asked as Judy and Ina continued to bicker. Moss explained the series of events as he had seen them.
You did what you thought was right,
Gibbs assured him. But his words lacked conviction. She'll never forgive me, Moss whimpered.
She shouldn't.
She will, Gibbs said. She knows you.
I don't,
Moss said, all the guilt and confusion he had felt in the past few days finding a home in 2 words. Byrne, who had been watching the whole thing unfold in silence, turned and spoke to Moss again.
Let's get you to the farrier,
he said. That would be best, Grimy agreed, and Moss wondered if he meant for medical reasons or to get him out of there. Moss knew he had been listening while pretending to focus solely on his foot. He knew that even after Ina's defense of the situation, they would blame him for Rosetta's death. Even Ina, who was being kind to Moss about it, was very obviously upset and trying to hide her feelings. Yeah, Moss agreed, more interested in leaving the room than the prospect of cybernetics. They left the room in a hurry.
I know what you're thinking, young'un,
Byrne began, and Moss listened in sullen silence.
We needed to come. You must understand that. The second that button was pressed, Ina was up a creek. And if we hadn't come, we'd have lost 2 instead of 1. You're gonna feel the pangs of guilt, I know it. But Ina and Chicken Thumbs are breathing now because we came. Carcer moved when that button got hit. You made a tough call. And it was the right one, so don't sit in sorrow.
Moss felt the truth of his words. He knew Byrne was right. But the image of Rosetta dead stared at him every time he closed his eyes.
And your friend,
Byrne added.
You shot her to save her. Timing fucked you, no getting around it. But I'll work with you to get her out. If and she still wants it.
Thank you, Moss said, taking some small solace in that idea. He imagined her waking up, feeling the betrayal Moss had felt when he thought she turned on the alarms.
1 leg or 2?
Byrne asked, and though Moss knew it was a tactic for distracting him, he was grateful. Just the 1, I think, he answered.
All right,
he said, hailing a cab electronically, which descended out of the rain almost as soon as it was ordered. Moss was leery as they moved toward the vehicle. Is it safe to fly so soon?
Should be,
Byrne answered.
Lots of traffic at night, and we are heading away from where we came,
he explained. That's good. Moss breathed a sigh of relief.
Not all good news,
Byrne said, lighting a cigarette in the confinement of the cab as it took off.
We all wore scrambling outfits to hide from the cameras, but Thudico Techs will be working with the footage. They'll figure it was us before too long, and they'll set a new bounty. It'll be harder to make our next move.
Moss nodded. He knew his life had changed. Knew he had killed a person. Become a criminal. But the reality of spending his whole life on the run and looking over his shoulder terrified him. Why didn't they warn me? Moss asked. And when Byrne didn't answer, he continued. My parents, my grandma, someone. They could have left me a message somewhere, so I could know what to do, what my place is. I feel like I didn't know any of them at all. Like I'm chasing shadows. No, worse, like I'm chasing shadows in a dream. I mean, my dad left you a message, but not me. That's hard. Byrne turned to look at him through the eerie smoke.
I say, he didn't leave you a message?
No, but I just assumed. Moss started, but Byrne held up a hand, ash cascading down his hand.
You assume, and you prattle, but I need you to listen and hear,
Byrne said.
You got caught up in this and it's been moving fast. It won't always be that way, and in the downtime you need to be smart. Watch the world, wait for opportunities. You have a long way to go, and I'll help you get there. Everyone back there will. Even Judy, despite how they treat you now. This crew, we are a family.
Moss nodded. I've already begun to see that.
Now, you want to see what your dad said?
Byrne asked, his one eye piercing Moss. Yes, please, Moss answered, trying to sound calm, unsuccessfully.
All right, Byrne said. You want me to project it here? Means you won't have privacy from me.
You haven't watched it? Moss's eyes went wide. Byrne snorted.
Weren't mine to watch.
It's okay, Moss told him, so happy to know that there was a video, that he didn't care who saw it. Byrne tapped at his palm, and once again the face of Moss's father was before him. Hey, Mossy, he said. turning from the camera bashfully. He was much younger and less frazzled than in the other videos. Seems trite to say this, but I guess if you're watching this, it means they got me. I'm sure you have 1,000,001 questions. They will all be answered in due time. But know that your mom, Grandma, and I have always been proud of you. And know you will continue to make us proud. If you are watching this, it also means you got out and found Byrne. He may seem like an asshole, but he is a good man, and will help you any way he can.